Have you ever met someone and felt something almost frighteningly familiar? You barely know them, yet your heart reacts as if it has been waiting for them. Their eyes feel known, their voice reaches somewhere deep, and when they pull away, the pain feels far too old for such a new connection. Welcome to the Love Your Soul Remembers, a Vedic-inspired audiobook exploring why some people enter our lives and awaken a love that feels older than memory itself. Stay until Chapter 7, because the deepest mystery is not why you love them so quickly. It is why your soul seems to remember them before your mind does. Chapter 1. The heart recognizes them before the mind understands them. Some people enter your life slowly, giving you enough time to understand who they are, how they think, what they fear, what they love, and whether they deserve a place in your heart. But then there are those rare people who arrive without warning and somehow feel important before they have done anything to earn that importance. You may have known them for only a few minutes, yet something inside you becomes unusually still when they speak. Their eyes seem to carry a familiarity you cannot place, and instead of feeling as though you are meeting a stranger, you feel as though you have stepped into the middle of a story that began long before this moment. This is where the mystery of an ancient feeling connection begins, because your conscious mind immediately starts searching for an explanation. You wonder whether you have seen them somewhere before, whether you once shared a school, a city, a workplace, a mutual friend, or some forgotten moment that could explain why their presence feels so familiar. But no matter how carefully you search your memory, nothing appears. There is no photograph, no previous introduction, no obvious history, and yet the feeling remains, quietly insisting that something about this person is not completely new. Vedic-inspired wisdom offers one possible way to understand such experiences through the idea of samskaras, the subtle impressions created by powerful experiences, emotions, habits, relationships, and actions. Within traditions that accept rebirth, these impressions are sometimes understood as tendencies that may continue beyond the visible boundaries of one lifetime, not necessarily as clear memories with names and faces, but as emotional traces, deep inclinations, unexplained attractions, or a sense of recognition that appears before the rational mind knows what it is recognizing. Perhaps this is why certain people affect us before we know anything about them. You may enter a crowded room filled with strangers, yet your attention goes toward one person without any obvious reason, and when your eyes finally meet, the world seems to become slightly quieter for a moment. You do not necessarily feel dramatic excitement. Sometimes what appears is something much more subtle and powerful, a calm sense of familiarity, a strange sadness, an unexpected warmth, or the feeling that some hidden part of you has been waiting for this exact meeting and has finally whispered, "There you are." What makes this experience even more mysterious is how quickly ordinary barriers can disappear. With most new people, we are careful. We measure our words, we watch how they respond, and we slowly decide whether it is safe to reveal more of ourselves. But around certain individuals, this process seems to happen unusually fast. You may find yourself speaking honestly without planning to, laughing without trying to impress them, or sitting in silence without the discomfort that usually exists between strangers. And afterward you are left wondering why someone you barely know already feels easier to be around than people who have been in your life for years. But this is where spiritual curiosity must be joined by wisdom, because familiarity alone is not proof of a past life connection, and it is certainly not proof that someone is safe, healthy, or destined to remain with you. Human beings are deeply influenced by patterns from this lifetime as well, and sometimes a person feels familiar because they resemble an emotional environment we already know. Someone who grew up having to earn affection may feel instantly drawn toward a person who makes love difficult to receive, while someone accustomed to instability may mistake emotional chaos for intensity and intensity for destiny, which is why the feeling of recognition must always be examined rather than blindly obeyed. The real question is not simply, does this person feel familiar? But, What kind of familiarity is this creating inside me? Does their presence bring clarity, honesty, peace, and a deeper sense of yourself? Or does it create anxiety, obsession, fear, dependency, and the constant need to be chosen? Does the connection encourage you to become more grounded and truthful, or does it make you ignore reality because you desperately want the relationship to mean something extraordinary? A spiritually meaningful bond should not require you to abandon discernment, because recognition may invite you to pay attention, but character must still determine whether someone deserves your trust. This is especially important because not every powerful connection arrives with comfort. Sometimes you meet someone and immediately feel tension, irritation, defensiveness, or an unexplained need for their approval, even though they have done very little to create such a strong reaction. Their opinion matters more than it should. One small disagreement affects you far more than expected, or their distance creates an emotional response that seems completely out of proportion to the amount of time you have known them. In those moments, the connection may feel ancient, not because it is peaceful, but because it seems to touch something unfinished. Within a Vedic-inspired framework, one might imagine that if consciousness carries impressions, it could carry unresolved tension just as easily as affection, which means a person who once represented conflict, responsibility, betrayal, protection, rivalry, or unfinished duty might feel just as familiar as someone associated with love. The soul, in this way of thinking, may recognize the quality of the bond without remembering the role, and this is why it can be a mistake to assume that every mysterious connection must have been romantic. Someone who feels deeply familiar today may have been connected to you through friendship, family, teaching, service, conflict, or some other relationship whose emotional imprint remains stronger than its forgotten details. This changes the entire meaning of recognition, because instead of rushing to ask, "Were we lovers before?" you begin asking something much more useful. What is this person awakening in me now? Perhaps they awaken courage you had forgotten, tenderness you had buried, spiritual curiosity you had ignored, or a desire to live more honestly than you have been living. Perhaps they expose your fear of abandonment, your need for approval, your difficulty setting boundaries, or the way you lose yourself whenever someone becomes emotionally important. In either case, the relationship becomes meaningful not simply because the other person feels familiar, but because something within you becomes visible the moment they arrive. There are connections that act almost like mirrors, revealing parts of us that remained hidden in ordinary relationships. You may believe you are independent until one person appears and suddenly you discover how deeply you fear losing someone. You may believe you have healed from the past until one conversation awakens anger or grief you thought was gone, or you may think your life is complete until someone enters and reminds you of a dream, purpose, or spiritual hunger you abandoned years ago. The person may not be creating these things from nothing. They may simply be touching a place inside you that was already waiting to be awakened. This is why some brief encounters remain unforgettable. You may know someone for only a month and still remember them years later, not because the relationship itself lasted a long time, but because your inner life shifted when they appeared. Perhaps they said one sentence that changed how you saw yourself. Perhaps they treated you with a kind of respect you did not realize you had been missing. Or perhaps their presence forced you to confront a fear you had spent years avoiding, and long after the person is gone, the effect of the meeting remains. Time does not always measure significance. Some relationships last for decades and never reach the deeper layers of who we are, while others last only a short season, yet permanently change our direction. And this is one of the reasons people become fascinated by the idea of past life connections. When emotional weight appears faster than history can explain it, the mind naturally begins searching for a larger story, but the wiser path is not to invent certainty where none exists. You do not need to decide immediately that this person belongs to another lifetime. You only need to notice that the encounter is asking something from you. Perhaps the person makes you feel more alive, more creative, more courageous, more compassionate, or more honest than you have felt in years. And if that happens, do not make the mistake of believing those qualities belong to them. The courage was yours, the tenderness was yours, the curiosity was yours, and the person may simply have become the spark that revealed what was already present. A meaningful connection should eventually return you to yourself, rather than make you believe that you cannot exist without the other person. This is where the difference between recognition and attachment becomes important. Recognition may quietly say, "Something about you feels familiar," while attachment says, "Without you, I cannot be complete." One opens the door to awareness, while the other can easily become dependence. And the more spiritually significant a relationship feels, the more important it becomes to understand that difference. Even if you truly did know someone before, the purpose of meeting again would not necessarily be to recreate the old relationship exactly as it once was. Perhaps the purpose is to transform what remained unfinished. Maybe the old pattern was dependency, and the present lesson is self-respect. Maybe the old pattern was control, and the present lesson is freedom. Maybe the old pattern was silence, and the present lesson is honest communication. Maybe the old pattern was fear of separation, and the present lesson is learning to love without possession. If so, the person may feel familiar precisely because an old emotional movement has been activated again. But this time, you are being given the opportunity to respond with greater awareness. This is why you should never allow a feeling of destiny to make you ignore present reality. Even if someone's eyes seem ancient, you must still watch how they behave today. Even if their voice feels known, you must still learn whether their words can be trusted. Even if your heart reacts instantly, you must still notice whether they respect your boundaries, take responsibility for their choices, communicate honestly, and allow you to grow. A supposed connection from another life can never replace the need for character in this one. Perhaps this is the most important wisdom hidden inside the first sign. The heart may recognize something before the mind understands it, but the recognition is not the conclusion, it is the beginning of the question. You are not being asked to immediately decide who this person was, what role they once played, or whether they are destined to remain forever. You are being asked to observe what becomes active in your consciousness when they appear. Notice whether old wounds rise. Notice whether forgotten strength returns. Notice whether you become more truthful or more afraid. Notice whether the connection awakens growth or merely creates obsession. Notice whether you feel as though you are becoming more deeply yourself or slowly disappearing in your attempt to keep the person close. Because these signs will reveal far more about the purpose of the connection than any imagined story about another lifetime. And perhaps one day, after enough time has passed, you will understand why the first meeting felt so unusual. Maybe the person becomes a lifelong companion. Maybe they remain only a friend. Maybe they challenge you. Maybe they leave. Or maybe their role is brief but unforgettable. Whatever happens, their significance will eventually be measured not by how mysterious the beginning felt, but by what the relationship awakened, healed, exposed, or transformed within you. So when you meet someone and your heart reacts before your mind can explain why, do not rush to call it destiny, and do not dismiss the feeling either. Remain curious, remain grounded, and allow the present life to reveal what the connection means, because perhaps the deepest mystery is not whether you knew this person before, but why their arrival makes some hidden part of you feel as though it has finally recognized something it has been waiting a very long time to remember. Chapter 2. Why their eyes, voice, and presence feel strangely familiar. Sometimes the mystery is not in what a person says to you, but in what happens inside you before they say anything at all, because there are rare people whose eyes seem to carry a familiarity that reaches deeper than appearance, whose voice settles into your awareness with an ease that feels strangely known, and whose presence can create comfort, longing, sadness, or calm long before enough shared history exists to explain why you are reacting so strongly. You may meet someone in the most ordinary setting, perhaps during a conversation, at work, while traveling, through a friend, or in a place you never expected to meet anyone important, yet the moment they begin speaking, something inside you becomes attentive in a way you cannot control. Their voice may not be extraordinary to anyone else, but to you it feels as though it touches a hidden memory, not a clear memory of a specific event, but an emotional familiarity, almost as if some part of you has heard that rhythm, that softness, that way of speaking, somewhere beyond the reach of conscious recall. Then there are the eyes, and for many people this is where the feeling becomes strongest, because a face can be new while a gaze somehow feels ancient. You look at someone and experience the strange sensation that they are not entirely unknown to you, even though your rational mind has no evidence to support that feeling. Perhaps their eyes create an immediate sense of trust, perhaps they awaken an unexplained sadness, or perhaps you feel seen in a way that usually takes years to experience with another person, and you begin wondering why one simple look has affected you more deeply than entire conversations with people you have known for much longer. Within a Vedic-inspired understanding, one possible explanation for this kind of recognition lies again in the idea of samskaras, the subtle impressions that may remain within consciousness after powerful experiences. If strong relationships create deep emotional patterns, then perhaps what returns is not the physical face, because the body changes from life to life, but the quality of the connection, the emotional tone, the sense of familiarity, or the way your consciousness responds when you are near a certain person. You may not remember what they looked like before, but perhaps something about the experience of being with them awakens a feeling that seems older than the present moment. This is why some people describe meeting someone and thinking, "I do not recognize their face, but I recognize something behind it." Whether this is spiritual intuition, emotional pattern recognition, psychological familiarity, or something more mysterious cannot be proven simply through feeling, but the experience itself can be powerful enough to make you pause, because the mind is used to understanding relationships through time, and here the emotional response appears before time has had the opportunity to create it. Their presence may also affect your body in subtle ways. Around most strangers, you may remain slightly guarded without even realizing it, your attention alert, your words carefully chosen, your body quietly assessing whether the situation feels safe. But around this person you may notice that your shoulders relax, your breathing slows, and you stop thinking so carefully about how you are being perceived. It feels as though your nervous system has accepted them before your mind has completed its evaluation, and afterward you may wonder why you felt more at ease during 1 hour with this person than during months with others. But sometimes the opposite happens, because familiarity is not always comforting. A certain voice may make you tense without explanation, a particular expression may awaken sudden sadness, or the person's presence may make your heart race even when nothing dramatic is happening. You may feel drawn toward them and uneasy at the same time, as though part of you wants to come closer while another part wants to protect itself. And this mixture of attraction and caution can make the connection feel even more mysterious. If you approach this through a Vedic-inspired karmic lens, such a reaction could symbolize something unresolved rather than something romantic. Perhaps the emotional impression is connected to responsibility, conflict, separation, betrayal, protection, or an unfinished lesson, and the strong reaction appears because the present meeting has touched something deeper than the conscious mind can identify. Again, this is not proof of a previous life, but it is a useful way of asking why certain people activate such powerful internal responses before they have done anything significant in the present. The voice can be especially powerful because sound enters us differently than appearance. You can close your eyes and still feel someone's presence through their voice alone, and sometimes one person's way of speaking carries an emotional weight that is difficult to explain. They may say your name and something about the way it sounds makes you pause, or they may tell a story and you feel as though you already know the emotional world behind their words. Perhaps their laughter brings warmth you cannot place, or a quiet sadness in their tone reaches you before they ever explain what they are carrying. This does not mean the soul literally recognizes a particular voice from another life, because the physical voice belongs to the present body, but perhaps what feels familiar is the deeper pattern of expression, the way attention is given, the emotional rhythm, the kindness, intensity, humor, patience, or vulnerability that seems strangely known. Sometimes what we recognize is not the sound itself, but what the sound awakens. And then there is something even more subtle, the way a person occupies silence. With some people, silence is uncomfortable because both of you feel pressure to keep the conversation alive. But with others, silence can feel almost complete, as though nothing is missing. You can sit beside them without speaking and still feel connected, and this can be deeply surprising when the relationship is new, because comfortable silence usually belongs to people who have spent a long time together. You may find yourself thinking, why does it feel as though I do not need to fill the space with words? Perhaps this is because the connection creates an unusual sense of safety, perhaps because your personalities naturally fit together, or perhaps, within the spiritual framework we are exploring, the silence feels familiar because some deeper impression of connection is already present before the conscious mind can name it. This kind of familiarity can also appear in tiny movements. The way they tilt their head when listening, the way they pause before answering, the way they smile when they are trying not to laugh, or even the way they become quiet when they are hurt, may feel strangely predictable to you. You may catch yourself knowing what they are about to say or sensing their mood before they speak, and you begin wondering how you can understand someone so quickly. There are ordinary explanations for this too. Human beings are incredibly skilled at reading subtle cues, body language, tone, facial expressions, and patterns without consciously realizing how much information we are processing. Yet sometimes the speed of understanding feels unusual enough that both people notice it, and one of them eventually says the sentence that seems to appear in so many powerful connections: "Why does it feel like we have known each other forever?" That sentence can be beautiful, but it can also become dangerous if you allow it to replace discernment, because feeling understood quickly does not mean you fully know the person. A relationship can feel ancient while the present personality remains largely unknown, and this is where many people rush into emotional commitments because familiarity creates the illusion that time is unnecessary. They reveal too much, trust too quickly, ignore warning signs, or assume that a spiritual feeling guarantees a healthy future. But if there is one lesson this audiobook must keep returning to, it is that a mysterious connection does not cancel the need for present life wisdom. Even if someone's eyes feel familiar, you must still observe their actions. Even if their voice feels like home, you must still notice whether their words are honest. Even if their presence calms you, you must still watch whether they respect your boundaries, whether they can handle disagreement, whether they take responsibility for mistakes, and whether the relationship helps you become more grounded rather than more dependent. The soul, if it does recognize something ancient, may be inviting you to notice the connection, but it is not asking you to surrender your judgment. A feeling can be meaningful without being an instruction, and sometimes the most spiritually mature response is to hold the mystery gently rather than turning it immediately into a story about destiny. There is another reason the eyes can feel so powerful, and it has less to do with mystical memory and more to do with truth. The eyes can reveal emotion before words are prepared, and when two people make genuine eye contact, they often receive information that is difficult to hide. Fear, tenderness, hesitation, longing, grief, warmth, and attention can appear in a fraction of a second, and perhaps part of what feels like recognition is simply the experience of seeing and being seen without the usual layers of performance. Imagine that you have spent years being around people who listen only to respond, people who look at you but do not really see you, people who know your role but not your inner world, and then one person appears whose attention feels complete. They listen to what you say, but they also seem to notice what you avoid saying, and this can create a powerful feeling of being known, even before the relationship has enough history to justify it. You may interpret this as, "My soul remembers them," but perhaps part of the deeper truth is, "My soul recognizes what it feels like to be seen." That distinction is important, because the person may not be familiar because of who they were before. They may feel familiar because they awaken a state within you that you have been missing for a long time. Around them, you feel less divided. You do not need to perform. You do not need to protect every emotion. You do not need to prove that you are stronger, smarter, happier, or more successful than you truly feel. And when you finally experience that kind of presence, it can feel older than the relationship, because the longing for it is older than the relationship. Sometimes we are not recognizing the person. We are recognizing the feeling of being understood, the feeling of being accepted, the feeling of being able to exist without constantly defending who we are. This is why a connection can feel like home, even when the person is new. The word home does not always describe a place or a history. Sometimes it describes an internal state in which you no longer feel you must run from yourself. But here again, there is a warning, because what feels like home may not always be healthy. Human beings often confuse familiarity with safety, and if your emotional history was shaped by inconsistency, criticism, emotional distance, or chaos, then a person who recreates those patterns may feel strangely familiar too. You may feel pulled toward them because they recreate something your nervous system already knows, even if that pattern causes pain. This is why you must ask not only whether their presence feels familiar, but what their presence actually produces over time. Do you become calmer, clearer, and more honest around them? Or more anxious, confused, and desperate for reassurance? Do you feel safe enough to be yourself, or are you constantly trying to become whatever you think will keep them interested? Does their voice bring genuine peace, or does it become something you need in order to feel emotionally stable? The difference between connection and dependence can be subtle at first, especially when a relationship feels unusually intense, but over time, the distinction becomes clearer. A meaningful connection may make you value the other person deeply while still allowing you to remain centered within yourself, while dependence makes you believe that their attention is necessary for your peace, their approval is necessary for your worth, and their presence is necessary for your identity. If the connection is spiritually significant, perhaps its deeper purpose is not to make you more dependent, but to teach you how to love with awareness. Maybe you are being shown what it feels like to be truly present with another human being, but you are also being asked to remain present with yourself. This is especially important when the person's presence creates an intense sense of peace, because you may begin believing, "Only they can make me feel this way." But perhaps the peace they awaken is evidence of a capacity that already exists inside you. Their presence becomes a doorway, but the peace itself may belong to you. If someone makes you feel safe enough to breathe more deeply, perhaps the lesson is not to cling to them forever, but to learn how to create that safety within yourself as well. If someone makes you feel understood, perhaps the lesson is to begin understanding yourself more honestly. If their voice quiets your mind, perhaps the deeper invitation is to discover the silence within you that does not depend entirely on another person's presence. This is how a relationship becomes spiritual rather than merely emotional. It stops being only about what the person gives you and begins revealing what the connection awakens within you. The eyes, the voice, the presence, the comfort, the emotional familiarity, these may all become signs that something inside you is responding deeply, but the real wisdom lies in what you do with that response. Do you become obsessed with explaining the past, or do you become more conscious in the present? Do you turn the person into proof of destiny, or do you allow the relationship to teach you something about love, attachment, trust, and self-knowledge? Perhaps you will never know why their voice seemed familiar the first time you heard it. Perhaps you will never understand why looking into their eyes created such a strange sense of recognition. Maybe there is an ordinary explanation, maybe there is a spiritual one. and maybe the full truth lies somewhere beyond what the mind can currently prove. But you can know what happens after the recognition. You can observe whether the person brings truth into your life. You can observe whether you become more awake. You can notice whether the familiarity slowly deepens into trust or collapses under reality. And this is why time remains one of the greatest teachers in any mysterious connection. If the feeling is only fantasy, time will reveal contradictions. If it is merely projection, reality will slowly separate the person from the image you created. But if the connection has genuine depth, time will not destroy the familiarity. It will give it substance. The eyes that once felt known will become eyes you have actually learned to understand. The voice that once sounded familiar will become a voice whose truthfulness you have witnessed. The presence that once felt strangely safe will become meaningful because it has been accompanied by consistency, respect, and real shared experience. Then the mystery becomes something more grounded. You no longer say only, "You feel familiar." You can say, "Now I know who you are in this life too." That may be one of the most beautiful outcomes of an ancient feeling connection, because the spiritual mystery and present reality begin to meet. You do not need to know who they were before. You begin learning who they are now. And perhaps that is what matters most. So if there is someone whose eyes seem to carry a story you cannot remember, whose voice feels strangely close, or whose simple presence makes your heart feel as though it has arrived somewhere familiar, do not rush to name the bond. Stay awake. Let the mystery remain. Let time reveal character. Let the present life create its own memories, because perhaps the reason this person feels so familiar is not that you are meant to spend your life chasing the past. Perhaps their presence is simply opening the next door, and what matters now is not whether you recognize where you have been together before, but what kind of connection you are capable of creating with them this time. Chapter 3. Why the emotion feels too deep for such a new connection. There are connections that seem to ignore the ordinary rules of time, because sometimes you can know someone for only a few weeks and still feel as though they have been part of your emotional world for years. Their happiness affects you more than expected. Their absence feels heavier than it should, and one small change in their tone can remain in your thoughts long after the conversation ends. You may even catch yourself wondering why a person who has only recently entered your life already seems capable of touching places inside you that others could not reach after years. This is where the connection begins to feel almost impossible to explain, because the present relationship is still young, but the emotion feels old. Your mind knows there has not been enough time to build this level of attachment, yet your heart behaves as if something important has already been shared, lost, remembered, and returned. You may feel tenderness that surprises you, protectiveness you cannot justify, or a strange fear of losing the person before the relationship has even had enough time to become secure. Vedic-inspired wisdom gives us one possible lens through which to understand this: through karma and samskaras, the subtle impressions created by powerful experiences and emotional bonds. If consciousness carries deep impressions, then perhaps some relationships feel unusually intense because the present encounter touches something that was already present within you, whether that impression comes from this lifetime, an old emotional pattern, or, within a rebirth framework, something carried forward beyond conscious memory. The important thing is that the emotion arrives quickly and seems larger than the visible cause. Perhaps the person sends you a short message and you feel unusually relieved, or they become distant for one evening and you feel as though something precious is slipping away. Maybe they smile at you and the warmth stays with you for hours, or a small disagreement creates sadness far greater than the situation itself. These reactions can feel confusing because you know logically that the relationship is still new, yet your emotional world responds as though the stakes are much higher. This is why people often mistake intensity for certainty. When a connection feels powerful, the mind wants to give it a powerful explanation, and the idea of a past life bond can feel especially attractive because it seems to explain why the emotion is so deep so quickly. But wisdom requires caution here, because strong emotion does not automatically mean sacred destiny, and deep attraction does not automatically mean that the relationship is healthy, permanent, or spiritually meant to continue. Sometimes a person awakens love, and sometimes they awaken a wound that has been waiting for the right trigger. The difference is not always obvious in the beginning. You may think you are experiencing ancient love, when what is actually being activated is an old fear of abandonment. You may believe the connection is spiritually irresistible when the person simply fits an emotional pattern your nervous system already knows. If you have spent years feeling that love must be earned, someone who gives attention inconsistently may affect you more strongly than someone who is steady and kind, because the old pattern of chasing feels familiar even when it is painful. This is why one of the most important questions in a connection like this is not, how intense is the feeling, but what is the feeling asking me to do? If the emotion makes you abandon yourself, ignore your values, tolerate disrespect, or become dependent on the other person's attention, then the intensity may be revealing something that needs healing rather than something that needs to be followed. If the connection makes you more honest, more grounded, more compassionate, and more aware of yourself, then it may be awakening something very different. The emotion itself is the doorway, but awareness determines where that doorway leads. Consider how quickly fear can appear around certain people. You may normally be calm in relationships, but with this person you become unusually sensitive to distance. A late reply becomes a source of anxiety. A cancelled plan feels like rejection. One quiet evening makes you wonder whether they are losing interest, and you begin reacting to possibilities rather than reality. The relationship may be new, but the fear feels ancient. Why would such a small event create such a large reaction? Perhaps the present moment is touching a much older wound. Maybe you have been abandoned before. Maybe you learned early in life that affection can disappear without warning. Maybe your deepest fear has always been that people will leave once you become attached. Or, within the spiritual framework we are exploring, perhaps the relationship awakens an emotional impression connected to separation, loss, or unfinished attachment that feels deeper than the visible story. Whatever its origin, the feeling is real, but the interpretation must remain wise. The emotion does not necessarily tell you what is true about the other person. It tells you what has been activated inside you. That distinction can change everything. Instead of saying, "They are pulling away, so I am about to lose them," you begin asking, "Why does distance create so much fear in me?" Instead of saying, "I cannot survive without this connection," you ask, "What part of me believes another person must stay in order for me to feel safe?" Instead of turning every emotional reaction into evidence of destiny, you begin using the relationship as a mirror. And sometimes what the mirror reveals is beautiful. You may meet someone and discover that you are capable of far more tenderness than you imagined. Their presence brings out patience, generosity, courage, and softness that had been hidden beneath years of disappointment. You may find yourself caring about their well-being without needing anything in return, or wanting them to succeed even if their success does not directly benefit you. This kind of emotion can also feel ancient because it does not feel manufactured. You are not trying to convince yourself to care. The care is already there. Perhaps you see them hurting and immediately feel compassion. Perhaps their joy makes you genuinely happy. Perhaps you want to protect them, not because you believe they belong to you, but because something in you values their existence deeply. This is where a strong connection can become spiritually beautiful, because love begins to expand beyond possession. But even here, there is a lesson. Protectiveness can become control. Care can become dependency. Compassion can become self-sacrifice. So the question remains, does the emotion stay conscious? A meaningful bond should not require you to lose yourself in order to prove that it is meaningful. Vedic-inspired philosophy repeatedly points toward awareness, discernment, and freedom from blind attachment. This means that even the deepest emotion must eventually be examined. You can love someone intensely and still remain honest about who they are. You can care deeply and still maintain boundaries. You can miss someone and still allow them freedom. You can feel a powerful bond and still accept that the relationship may not be meant to become what you hoped. This is one of the hardest lessons in ancient feeling love, because the heart often assumes that depth should guarantee permanence. If the emotion feels extraordinary, we naturally expect the relationship to become extraordinary too. But sometimes the connection is deep precisely because it is revealing a lesson rather than promising an outcome. Perhaps the person enters your life to awaken love, but not necessarily to become your lifelong partner. Perhaps they expose your fear of loss so that you can finally heal it. Perhaps they show you how deeply you can care. Then life asks you to carry that capacity forward without clinging to the person who awakened it. This can feel unfair at first, but it can also become one of the most transformative understandings of love. Imagine knowing someone for only a short time, yet after they leave, you notice that something inside you has changed. You become more open with your family, more grateful for the people who remain, more willing to speak honestly, and more aware of how quickly life can change. The relationship may not have lasted, but what it awakened continues. That is significance. Not all deep connections are measured by how long they remain. Some are measured by how much they reveal. Sometimes the emotion feels too deep because the person has touched a layer of you that ordinary relationships never reached. Perhaps you have spent years protecting your heart, convinced that you no longer need anyone, and then one person appears and the walls begin falling without permission. You may even resent them for it, because vulnerability feels dangerous. But underneath the fear you realize something important. You had not stopped needing connection. You had simply become skilled at avoiding the risk of it. This is another way a powerful relationship becomes a teacher. The person may not be the answer to your loneliness. They may be the one who reveals that loneliness still exists. They may not be the source of your vulnerability. They may simply expose the fact that you have been hiding it. And perhaps that is why the emotion feels so much larger than the relationship itself. The person has become connected not only to who they are, but to everything they awaken inside you. Their presence becomes linked to hope, fear, longing, healing, self-discovery, and possibility. So the emotional weight grows faster than the visible history. This can also happen when someone arrives during a vulnerable period in your life. If you meet them after loss, heartbreak, isolation, or major change, the connection may become powerful very quickly because you are emotionally open in a way you normally are not. They arrive when something inside you is searching for meaning, and their presence becomes intertwined with the transformation already beginning within you. Again, this does not make the connection false. It simply means that timing matters. Sometimes the person feels extraordinary, partly because they met you at an extraordinary moment. But what if the timing itself is part of the mystery? Within a karmic worldview, one could imagine that certain people appear when an old pattern is ready to become visible. The relationship may feel intense because you are finally capable of confronting something that was previously hidden. A fear you ignored becomes impossible to ignore. A desire you suppressed becomes impossible to deny. Or a part of your identity begins changing because this connection has exposed how incomplete the old version of you has become. This is why intense emotion can sometimes be more about transformation than romance. You think you are falling deeply for another person, but at the same time, you are falling out of an old way of being. You become less willing to live dishonestly, less willing to settle, less willing to ignore what your heart actually wants. The person becomes associated with that shift, and suddenly the emotion feels enormous because it is carrying more than attraction. It is carrying change. This is also why some people become unforgettable, even when the relationship itself does not continue. Years later, you may realize that you do not actually miss the person in the same way anymore, but you still remember how different you became after meeting them. They were a turning point, and turning points can feel ancient because they seem connected to something larger than the visible moment. There is another side to this intensity that must be spoken about carefully. Sometimes the emotion is mutual, and sometimes it is not. You may feel a connection so deeply that you assume the other person must feel it too. The familiarity, the longing, the emotional response seem so powerful that it becomes difficult to imagine the experience could be one-sided. But another person's freedom must always be respected. A deep feeling within you does not automatically describe what exists within them. This is where spiritual language can become dangerous if used carelessly. Saying, "our souls are connected," cannot become a way of ignoring another person's boundaries, wishes, or choices. Even if you believe there is an ancient bond, the person standing before you has a present life, a present will, and the right to decide what kind of relationship they want. The highest form of love must include freedom. If the feeling is real, it does not need to become possession. This may be especially important in connections where the emotion feels too old, because the deeper the familiarity, the easier it becomes to believe you are entitled to closeness. But no imagined past gives you ownership over another person's present. Perhaps this itself is part of the lesson. Can you love someone deeply without trying to control what they choose? Can you honor a connection even if it develops differently than you hoped? Can you feel enormous emotion and still remain grounded enough to accept reality? These questions reveal whether the love is becoming conscious or merely becoming attachment. There may also come a point when you realize that the depth of the emotion is not asking you to move closer, but to look inward. A person's distance may trigger pain, but instead of immediately trying to change their behavior, you begin healing the part of yourself that believes distance equals rejection. Their independence may awaken jealousy, but instead of controlling them, you begin examining the insecurity beneath the jealousy. This is how emotion becomes spiritual practice. The relationship stops being only about whether the person stays. It becomes about whether you become more aware. Perhaps this is what karma is ultimately asking from us. Not automatic repetition, but conscious response. An old feeling appears. This time you notice it. An old fear appears. This time you do not obey it. An old urge to chase, control, or disappear appears. This time you pause, and that pause may be more spiritually significant than any vision of another lifetime. Because the real purpose of a karmic pattern, if such a pattern exists, would not be endless repetition, it would be transformation. Maybe that is why some new relationships feel emotionally enormous from the beginning. They are not merely adding another person to your life, they are activating a lesson that has been waiting for the right conditions. The person becomes the spark, but the fire is inside you. This is why you should never ask only, "Why do I love them so much?" Ask, "What does loving them reveal about me?" Does it reveal how deeply you can care? Does it reveal fear of abandonment? Does it reveal your need to be chosen? Does it reveal that you have spent years pretending not to need intimacy? Does it reveal that you are capable of forgiveness? Does it reveal where you still confuse love with possession? Every answer matters, and perhaps this is where the connection begins to show its real purpose. The person may have arrived as someone you wanted, but they may become someone through whom you understand yourself. That is a much deeper relationship than attraction alone. You can be attracted to many people. Very few force you to confront the architecture of your own heart. Very few make you understand why you fear, why you cling, why you run, why you love, or why you keep repeating the same emotional story. Those are the connections that remain. And maybe this is why, when you barely know someone yet feel an emotion that seems far too deep for the amount of time you have shared, the wiser response is neither to dismiss the feeling nor to surrender to it blindly. Observe it. Let it speak. Let time test it. Let character reveal whether the bond deserves to grow. Let the emotion show you what has been hidden, because perhaps the strange depth you feel is not proof that the person belongs to you. Perhaps it is evidence that they have reached a place inside you that had been waiting to be seen. And if that is true, then the real mystery is not why you can love someone so deeply when you barely know them. The real mystery is why meeting them makes your heart respond as though this emotion did not begin today, but simply found its way back to the surface after being silent for a very long time. Chapter 4. The strange fear that you have lost them before. There are some connections that do not only bring love, they bring fear with them from the very beginning. And that fear can be one of the strangest parts of the entire experience, because you may barely know the person, yet somewhere inside you there is already a quiet anxiety that one day they will disappear. Nothing terrible has happened, no promise has been broken, no separation has occurred, and still you may find yourself thinking about loss before the relationship has even had enough time to fully begin. You may ask yourself why you are afraid of goodbye when you have barely said hello, why one small distance feels heavier than it should, or why the idea of losing someone new can create a sadness that feels strangely old. The mind recognizes the contradiction because logically you know there is not yet enough history to explain such powerful fear. But the heart does not always follow the same clock, and sometimes it responds to a connection as though the story has already carried separation once before. This is where the fourth mystery begins, because love that feels older than the present relationship can sometimes carry an equally old sense of loss. You may look at the person during a peaceful moment and suddenly feel sadness without knowing why, almost as though happiness itself has awakened the fear that it will not last. The person may be sitting right beside you, yet a strange thought appears. What if I lose you? And the intensity of that thought can be so strong that it seems to come from somewhere deeper than ordinary worry. Vedic-inspired wisdom gives us one possible language for exploring this through samskaras and karmic impressions. If powerful experiences leave subtle traces within consciousness, then perhaps the emotional imprint of separation can remain even when the detailed memory is gone. Within traditions that accept rebirth, one could imagine that a person may not consciously remember losing someone in another life, but an old pattern of attachment, grief, or unfinished separation might become active when a similar connection appears again. This does not mean that fear is proof of a previous life, and it certainly does not mean that something bad is destined to happen. Anxiety, attachment history, childhood experiences, grief, betrayal, and insecurity from this lifetime can all create powerful fear around love, and those explanations should never be ignored. But spiritually, the experience can still be meaningful because it reveals something about how deeply the connection is touching your inner world. Perhaps the most important question is not, did I lose this person before? But why does the possibility of losing them awaken so much fear in me now? That question can open a door that no past life story alone can answer. Maybe you have spent years learning that people leave. Perhaps someone important disappeared when you were young, or love was inconsistent, or you learned to expect abandonment whenever closeness became real. If that pattern exists, then a new person who matters deeply can awaken the old fear almost instantly, and what feels like ancient memory may actually be the nervous system remembering a familiar danger from this life. But sometimes the emotional response still feels strangely disproportionate. Perhaps the person goes silent for a few hours and you feel as though something precious is being taken from you, or they mention traveling away and your heart reacts with a sadness you cannot explain. Maybe you find yourself imagining endings that have not happened, rehearsing goodbyes, or becoming unusually sensitive to any sign of distance. And the more you care, the more the fear grows. This is where love can become complicated, because fear of losing someone can quietly begin shaping how you behave toward them. You may start seeking reassurance constantly, checking whether they still care, analyzing every message, reading meaning into every pause, or trying to become so important to them that leaving you becomes impossible. What begins as affection slowly turns into vigilance, and without realizing it, you start trying to control the future so that you never have to feel the pain you are already imagining. But fear cannot create secure love. The more desperately you try to guarantee that someone will never leave, the less freedom the relationship has to breathe. You may ask for reassurance so often that reassurance stops feeling reassuring, because the real wound is not outside you. It is the belief that your peace depends upon another person staying exactly where you need them to stay. This is one of the most powerful lessons hidden inside the fear of loss. Sometimes, the connection does not arrive to guarantee permanence. It arrives to reveal your relationship with impermanence. Vedic philosophy repeatedly reminds us that forms change, bodies change, relationships change, seasons change, and life itself moves constantly. Love does not become meaningless because it changes, but attachment often suffers because it demands that what is changing must remain fixed. This is where love and attachment begin to separate from each other. Love says, "I value your presence." Attachment says, "Your presence must remain exactly as I need it." Love appreciates, attachment fears. Love can be deep and still allow freedom. Attachment can be deep and still become a prison. When a person feels strangely familiar, the fear of losing them can become even stronger, because the mind creates a story that says, "I waited too long to find you. I cannot lose you again." That feeling can be beautiful in poetry, but in real life it can become dangerous if it makes you abandon wisdom, tolerate disrespect, or cling to someone who is clearly choosing another path. If there truly is an old connection, perhaps the lesson is not to hold tighter this time. Perhaps the lesson is to love more consciously. Imagine that in some forgotten chapter, the bond ended through separation, death, betrayal, or circumstances beyond either person's control. If the emotional impression of that loss returned, what would growth look like now? Would it mean trying to control every possibility so that separation can never happen again? Or would it mean learning how to love deeply while accepting that another human being can never become your permanent possession? This is where the connection becomes spiritual rather than simply emotional. The person may awaken a fear you have carried for years, but you are being given the opportunity to respond differently. Instead of chasing reassurance every time fear appears, you can learn to sit with the fear and ask what it is protecting. Instead of demanding certainty, you can learn to appreciate what is real today. Instead of trying to control the other person, you can build trust through honesty, boundaries, and consistent action. Perhaps this is the karmic correction. Maybe the old pattern was clinging. Now the lesson is trust. Maybe the old pattern was fear. Now the lesson is presence. Maybe the old pattern was losing yourself inside someone else. Now the lesson is loving without abandoning your own center. This can be difficult because when fear is strong, the mind wants immediate relief. You want the person to say the perfect sentence, promise they will never leave, prove that the connection is permanent, and remove every uncertainty. But no human being can realistically give that kind of guarantee. Even the most loving relationship exists inside a changing world, and trying to remove every possibility of loss only makes the heart more anxious. The deeper work is learning that your life can remain whole even when love changes form. This does not mean becoming cold or pretending you do not care. It means understanding that the strength of love is not measured by how terrified you are of losing someone. Real depth does not require constant panic. In fact, the more secure love becomes, the less it needs to be proven every hour. Sometimes the person who feels too important is revealing an old wound that says, "If they leave, I will disappear too." This is where you must become especially aware, because a relationship should add to your life, not become the entire foundation of your identity. If your happiness, self-worth, purpose, and emotional stability all depend on one person's presence, then the fear of losing them will naturally become enormous. Perhaps the relationship feels ancient because it is touching something ancient inside you. The old human fear of separation, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that what we love can disappear. This fear is not unique to romance. It appears between parents and children, friends, siblings, teachers, partners, and anyone whose presence becomes meaningful. This is why the fourth sign is much bigger than a romantic idea. It is about what love reveals when impermanence becomes visible. You may be sitting beside someone you care about and suddenly realize that no moment can be frozen. The person is here now, but life will keep moving. This realization can make you anxious, or it can make you more awake. You can spend the entire relationship fearing the ending, or you can allow the awareness of impermanence to deepen the way you love today. You can listen more carefully, speak more honestly, apologize sooner, express gratitude while the person can still hear it. Stop postponing tenderness because you assume there will always be more time. This is where fear can transform into presence. Perhaps the lesson is not, how do I make sure I never lose them? Perhaps the lesson is, how do I stop wasting the time in which they are here? That is a far more powerful question. Imagine two people who care deeply for one another, but one person is so afraid of losing the relationship that they constantly test it. They create jealousy to see whether the other person reacts, withdraw to see whether they are chaste, start arguments to receive reassurance, or repeatedly ask whether the love is still real. The intention beneath the behavior may simply be fear, but the behavior slowly damages the connection they were trying to protect. This is how fear can create the very separation it is trying to prevent. The person thinks, I need proof that you will stay. But the repeated tests make staying more difficult. This is why awareness matters. When the fear appears, do not automatically turn it into action. Pause long enough to ask, is something actually wrong, or has an old wound become active? That one pause can change the relationship. Perhaps the person has genuinely become distant and a conversation is needed. Perhaps they have violated trust and your intuition is responding to real behavior. In that case, do not use spirituality to silence yourself. But perhaps nothing has happened and the fear belongs to a pattern inside you. Wisdom means learning the difference. A karmic connection, if you choose to understand it that way, should make you more conscious, not more superstitious. You should not interpret every quiet day as a sign that an ancient tragedy is repeating. You should not assume that because you feel afraid, loss is destined. Fear is not prophecy. This is crucial. Sometimes people feel a strong fear of losing someone and then begin treating that fear as spiritual intuition. They say, I just know something bad will happen, and the belief becomes so powerful that they cannot enjoy the relationship at all. But a feeling is not always a prediction. A feeling can be memory. A feeling can be anxiety. A feeling can be attachment. A feeling can be an old wound asking for attention. The wise response is to listen without automatically believing every story the mind builds around it. Nonamize bantanstes. This is especially important if the relationship feels unusually intense. The stronger the connection, the more powerful the imagination can become, and the mind may begin creating past life narratives that explain every emotion. Perhaps those stories are meaningful to you, but they should never replace reality. Ask what is actually happening now. Pantbanspes. Is the person present? Are they honest? Do they communicate? Do they treat you with respect? Is there real evidence of danger, or are you living inside imagined endings? Present reality must remain your anchor. There is another strange form of fear that sometimes appears: sadness during happy moments. You may be sitting with the person, laughing, feeling close, and suddenly an unexplained wave of grief passes through you. It may last only a few seconds, but it feels powerful enough to make you quiet. Why would happiness awaken grief? Perhaps because part of you knows happiness is temporary. Perhaps because past loss from this lifetime is being remembered emotionally. Or perhaps, within the spiritual possibility we are exploring, The closeness touches an impression of an older separation. Whatever the origin, the experience can teach something important. Nunamoj, do not allow the possibility of losing a beautiful moment to prevent you from fully living it. How many people spend years together while mentally preparing for loss? How many hold back love because they fear being hurt? How many refuse to become vulnerable because vulnerability means giving another person the power to matter? Then they call themselves protected, but they are also protected from intimacy. Sometimes the fear of losing someone is so strong that you never completely allow yourself to have them. You remain half present. You keep emotional distance. You never say what you feel. You prepare an escape route before the relationship even becomes stable. This is another form of attachment fear, and it can look very different from chasing. One person clings because they fear loss, while another withdraws for exactly the same reason. Both are controlled by the possibility of separation. Perhaps the karmic lesson is different for each. For the person who clings, the lesson may be freedom. For the person who runs, the lesson may be vulnerability. One must learn that love can survive space. The other must learn that love requires presence. This is why no single rule can explain every ancient feeling connection. The same fear can produce opposite behaviors. You must study your own pattern. When you care deeply, do you chase? Do you withdraw? Do you become controlling? Do you become silent? Do you start expecting rejection before it arrives? Do you test people? Do you stop expressing your needs because you fear being too much? These patterns reveal what the connection is asking you to understand. Perhaps the person has not appeared to repeat an old love story at all. Perhaps they have appeared to reveal how fear has been shaping your relationships. If that is true, then the most meaningful thing you can do is not search endlessly for who they were before, but become conscious of who you become around them now. Can you stay grounded when they need space? Can you speak honestly instead of creating tests? Can you hear no without collapsing? Can you express love without demanding a guarantee? Can you maintain your own friendships, purpose, health, and responsibilities while loving someone deeply? These are signs of emotional maturity, and perhaps spiritual maturity too. The Vedic-inspired idea of non-attachment is often misunderstood as emotional coldness, but non-attachment does not mean refusing to love. It means loving without turning another person into something you must possess in order to exist. This is a much more difficult form of love. It asks you to care deeply while remembering that both people remain free. It asks you to appreciate the connection without making your entire identity dependent upon it. It asks you to accept that life is changing while still showing up fully today. Perhaps this is the lesson hidden inside the strange fear that you have lost them before. Maybe something inside you remembers separation, literally or symbolically. But if so, the purpose of that memory is not necessarily to make you more afraid. Perhaps it is to teach you a better way to love this time. Maybe before, fear made you controlling. This time, choose trust. Maybe before, pride stopped you from saying what mattered. This time, speak. Maybe before, you wasted time believing the person would always be there. This time, appreciate them. Maybe before, you lost yourself inside the relationship. This time, keep your center. Maybe before, the connection ended with anger. This time, if separation comes, perhaps you can allow it to end with dignity. This is what it means to transform a pattern rather than repeat it. There is also a deeper truth that can be difficult to accept. Sometimes the fear of losing someone becomes real because not every relationship remains. People change, circumstances change, some connections end. And if that happens, the strength of the relationship is not measured by whether you prevented every ending. Sometimes it is measured by what remains inside you after the form has changed. If the person leaves, can you carry forward what the relationship awakened without turning the memory into a prison? Can you grieve and still continue? Can you honor what was real without refusing the future? Can you let an important chapter remain important without demanding that it become the entire book? This is where love becomes wiser. At first you may say, "I cannot lose you." Later, perhaps you learn to say, "I hope you stay, but I will not lose myself trying to make you stay." That is a powerful transformation, and if the person does remain, the relationship becomes healthier because it is no longer held together only by fear. You stay because both of you choose to stay, not because one person is constantly trying to prevent departure. This kind of love feels different. It breathes, it allows honesty, it allows space. It does not need constant proof. And perhaps this is what an ancient connection is asking from you now. Not greater desperation, but greater consciousness. Maybe the reason the fear feels so old is that the lesson is old, not necessarily the person, the lesson. Learning that love cannot be forced. Learning that attachment is not the same as devotion. Learning that another person can matter deeply without becoming your entire identity. Learning that impermanence does not make love meaningless. Perhaps you have spent many years believing the opposite, and this person has arrived at the exact moment you are ready to understand differently. If so, then the fear itself becomes valuable, not because fear should control you, but because it reveals the doorway. You can now see what has been hidden. You can see how quickly your mind imagines loss. You can see where you become dependent. You can see whether you confuse possession with security. Once you see it, you can begin choosing differently. This may be one of the deepest purposes of a karmic bond. Not simply to reunite two people, to make unconscious patterns visible enough to be transformed. So if there is someone in your life and loving them strangely feels like remembering a loss, do not rush to decide that you definitely lost them in another lifetime, and do not dismiss your emotion as meaningless either. Let the feeling teach you something about attachment, fear, vulnerability, and the way you love. Ask yourself whether you can love this person without constantly living in tomorrow's goodbye. Ask whether you can appreciate their presence without demanding certainty from the future. Ask whether your love allows both of you to remain whole. Because perhaps the deepest healing is not learning how to make sure you never lose someone again. Perhaps it is learning that you can love fully without allowing the fear of loss to destroy the love while it is still here. And maybe that is why this connection feels so old. Somewhere within the heart, the fear seems to say, "Do not lose them again," while the deeper wisdom quietly answers, "This time, do not lose yourself." Chapter 5. When love returns carrying an unfinished karmic lesson. Sometimes the most powerful connections are not the easiest ones, because a person can enter your life with extraordinary familiarity, deep affection, and an almost immediate sense that the bond matters. Yet after the first beauty of recognition begins to settle, something difficult starts repeating between you. The same misunderstanding returns, the same fear appears, the same emotional wound is touched again and again, and eventually you begin wondering why a connection that feels so meaningful also seems determined to bring you face to face with the exact parts of yourself you would rather avoid. This is where the idea of an unfinished karmic lesson becomes especially powerful, because Vedic-inspired traditions do not necessarily present karma as punishment waiting to hurt you. Karma can be understood more deeply as continuity, the way actions, intentions, attachments, habits, and unresolved tendencies create consequences that continue until awareness changes the pattern. From this perspective, a relationship may feel ancient, not simply because love once existed, but because something between the two people has not yet reached understanding. Perhaps this is why you can meet someone and experience immediate tenderness, yet within a short time the relationship begins touching the same painful question repeatedly. Maybe the lesson is trust, and every circumstance seems to force both of you to decide whether you will communicate honestly or retreat into suspicion. Maybe the lesson is abandonment, and whenever one person creates distance, the other becomes desperate to chase. Maybe the lesson is control, and one person constantly tries to secure the relationship while the other struggles to breathe inside it. Maybe the lesson is self-respect, and the connection repeatedly places you in situations where you must choose between keeping another person close and remaining loyal to your own dignity. This is what makes karmic feeling relationships so difficult to understand, because they often contain both attraction and resistance, both tenderness and pain, both a desire to come closer and an equally powerful impulse to protect yourself. You may think, if this connection is so deep, why is it so difficult? But perhaps depth and ease are not always the same thing. Sometimes the most important relationships are not those that immediately give you peace. They are the ones that reveal exactly where peace is missing within you. Imagine that you meet someone and feel as though you have known them forever, but every time they become quiet, something inside you panics. You begin wondering whether they are losing interest, whether you have done something wrong, whether another person has become more important, or whether the relationship is about to end. The present situation may be small, but the emotional reaction is enormous, and this is where the karmic lesson begins to show itself. The real issue may not be the silence itself. The silence may simply be touching an old wound that says, when someone becomes distant, I am about to be abandoned. If you remain unconscious, you may react automatically. You send more messages, demand reassurance, become angry, withdraw dramatically, or try to make the other person feel guilty for making you afraid, and perhaps this response pushes them further away. Then the fear becomes stronger, you chase harder, and the cycle feeds itself until both people believe the other is causing the entire problem. But what if the relationship has brought the pattern into the light precisely so that it can finally be seen? This is where karma becomes practical rather than mystical. You do not need to remember another lifetime to recognize repetition. You only need enough awareness to notice that the same emotional structure keeps rebuilding itself. The names change, the places change, the circumstances change, but the inner movement remains familiar. You fear being left, so you cling. You fear being controlled, so you withdraw. You fear being rejected, so you hide what you truly need. You fear being vulnerable, so you create distance before anyone else can create it for you. Then one particular person arrives and activates the pattern so strongly that you can no longer pretend it does not exist. Perhaps this is the gift hidden inside the difficulty. The relationship becomes a mirror large enough that you can finally see yourself. This does not mean you should stay in every painful relationship because you believe suffering is karmic. That would be a dangerous misunderstanding. If someone is abusive, manipulative, dishonest, or repeatedly violates your boundaries, spiritual language should never become an excuse to remain trapped. Sometimes the karmic lesson may be precisely that you are finally meant to leave where an older version of you would have stayed. This is important because people often hear the word karmic and immediately imagine that two souls are bound together until some invisible debt is paid. But a wiser understanding is that karma concerns learning, consequence, and choice. If the same destructive pattern keeps returning, the purpose may not be to endure more of it. The purpose may be to respond differently. Perhaps before, you begged someone to stay. This time, the lesson is dignity. Perhaps before, you controlled someone because you were terrified of losing them. This time, the lesson is freedom. Perhaps before, you remained silent and allowed resentment to grow. This time, the lesson is truth. Perhaps before, you carried hatred for years. This time, the lesson is forgiveness without surrendering your boundaries. Perhaps before, you confused love with sacrifice and gave until nothing of yourself remained. This time, the lesson is understanding that genuine love does not require self-erasure. When you begin looking at the connection this way, the question changes from, why is this person doing this to me, to, what is this relationship repeatedly asking me to understand? That question is not about blaming yourself. Another person is responsible for their choices, and if they behave cruelly or dishonestly, the responsibility belongs to them. But your freedom begins when you stop making your growth dependent upon whether they become different first. You can learn your lesson even if they refuse to learn theirs. You can become conscious even if they remain unconscious. You can stop repeating your part of the cycle even if they keep inviting you back into it. This may be one of the hardest truths in any deep connection, because sometimes we secretly believe that if the bond is spiritually significant, both people should awaken together. We imagine that the relationship should become beautiful once we understand its meaning, but that is not always what happens. One person may become ready for honesty, while the other still chooses avoidance. One may become ready for commitment, while the other remains afraid of closeness. One may develop boundaries while the other continues pushing against them. Spiritual growth does not guarantee that every relationship will survive. Sometimes growth reveals why the relationship cannot continue in its old form, and perhaps that is completion too. Think about how many relationships repeat because both people keep doing exactly what fear tells them to do. One person becomes insecure and begins controlling, so the other becomes suffocated and creates distance. The distance increases the insecurity, so control becomes stronger, which creates even more distance. Each person points at the other and says, "You are the reason I behave this way," but the pattern is larger than either individual action. The cycle survives because both sides keep feeding it. Now imagine that one person finally becomes aware. The fear appears, but instead of immediately controlling, they pause and communicate honestly. They say, "I notice that I become afraid when there is distance between us, and I do not want that fear to turn into control." Suddenly, something changes. The old pattern expected accusation, but received awareness instead. Or imagine the person who usually disappears whenever intimacy becomes uncomfortable. This time, rather than vanishing, they say, "I need some space, but I am not abandoning you, and I will come back to this conversation tomorrow." Again, the old pattern is interrupted. Nothing mystical happens outwardly. No divine voice speaks. No past life memory appears. But inside the relationship, something enormous has changed. The same trigger appeared, and a different response was chosen. If karma is understood as continuity of cause and effect, then this moment matters deeply because a new cause has entered the chain. A different choice creates a different future. Perhaps this is what karmic healing actually looks like, not remembering exactly what happened before, but refusing to keep becoming the same unconscious person when the same emotional challenge appears. This is why the relationship can feel as though it keeps returning you to one particular doorway. You may change the surface issue, but somehow the same deeper question remains. An argument about messages becomes an argument about trust. An argument about money becomes an argument about security. An argument about time becomes an argument about whether you matter. An argument about independence becomes an argument about control. Until the deeper question is understood, the surface problem keeps returning. Sometimes one person is asking, "Can I trust you not to leave?" The other is asking, "Can I love you without losing my freedom?" One is asking, "Do I matter enough to you?" The other is asking, "Will anything I give ever be enough?" One is asking, "Can you forgive me?" The other is asking, "Can I forgive without betraying myself?" These deeper questions often exist beneath ordinary conflicts, and when a connection feels ancient, the questions can carry unusual emotional weight. This may be why certain arguments seem far too intense for what actually happened. The event is small, the wound it touches is not. Perhaps someone forgets an important date, and the reaction is not only disappointment, but a deep sense of being unseen. Perhaps a person needs an evening alone, and the other experiences it as abandonment. Perhaps someone makes a harmless mistake, yet the response carries the emotional intensity of betrayal. Again, current life psychology can explain many of these reactions, and there is no need to dismiss that in favor of a mystical story. But from a Vedic-inspired perspective, the useful question remains the same. What samskara, what deep impression, What recurring tendency has been activated here? Because whether the wound is 5 years old or, within your spiritual belief, far older, the healing must happen in the present. This is where many people become fascinated with trying to discover who they were to one another in a previous life. They imagine that if they can learn the old story, everything will make sense. Perhaps they were lovers separated by family, perhaps one betrayed the other, perhaps one died unexpectedly, perhaps they made a promise. These stories may be emotionally meaningful, but they can also distract from the only place where change is possible. Now, suppose you somehow discovered that you had loved this person in another lifetime, but could not trust them. Would that knowledge create trust today? No. Trust would still need to be built through present behavior. Suppose you discovered that you once abandoned them. Would guilt alone repair the relationship now? No. You would still need to practice honesty, accountability, and kindness in this life. Suppose you learned that you had once been inseparable. Would that guarantee compatibility today? No. Both people now have different circumstances, personalities, responsibilities, and choices. This is why the present life cannot be sacrificed to the fascination of the past. Even if a bond is ancient, it must still become healthy now. This may be the greatest test of a karmic connection. Can two people turn familiarity into conscious love rather than unconscious repetition? Because it is possible to recognize someone deeply and still hurt them through the same old habits. It is possible to love someone and still control them. It is possible to feel spiritually connected and still avoid honest communication. It is possible to believe someone is your soulmate and still refuse to take responsibility for the way you treat them. Recognition alone is not evolution. Love alone is not wisdom. The lesson becomes complete when awareness changes behavior. This is why a powerful connection may repeatedly challenge the exact place where you are weakest. If you struggle with jealousy, perhaps the relationship repeatedly places you in moments where trust must be chosen. If you struggle with self-worth, perhaps you encounter someone whose approval you desperately want, until you realize how dangerous it is to let another person determine your value. If you struggle with boundaries, perhaps you meet someone you love so deeply that saying no feels impossible. Until life forces you to understand that a yes without truth eventually becomes resentment. If you struggle with control, perhaps you meet someone who cannot be controlled. If you struggle with vulnerability, perhaps you meet someone who can see through every wall you build. This can feel cruel when you are inside it. You ask, why did life send me the one person who triggers everything? But perhaps the trigger is revealing where freedom has not yet been developed. You cannot heal what remains invisible. The person may not be the enemy. They may be the mirror that makes avoidance impossible. Again, this does not excuse harmful behavior. A mirror can reveal your wound, while the person holding the mirror may still be wrong in how they behave. Two truths can exist at the same time. They may have hurt you, and the experience may also reveal something you need to heal. Spiritual maturity can hold both, without confusing them. You do not have to say, everything that happened was meant to happen. You can simply say, now that it happened, what can I understand? This shift restores your power, because when you believe everything depends on the other person changing, you remain trapped. You wait for their apology, their return, their understanding, their maturity, their decision. Your life becomes suspended while you watch them. But when you ask what is yours to learn, movement becomes possible. Maybe they never apologize. You can still heal. Maybe they never understand why they hurt you. You can still create boundaries. Maybe they never become the person you hoped they would be. You can still stop repeating your part of the pattern. This is especially important when love feels ancient, because the emotional pull can make separation almost impossible to imagine. You may tell yourself, no matter what happens, I cannot leave because our bond is too deep. But sometimes depth is precisely why discernment is required. A deep connection can teach you how to stay, A deep connection can also teach you how to leave. You must understand which lesson belongs to you. Some people leave too quickly whenever discomfort appears. They avoid difficult conversations, mistake every conflict for incompatibility, and protect themselves so strongly that real intimacy never develops. For them, the karmic lesson may be learning to remain present long enough to repair what can be repaired. Another person may stay far too long. They tolerate disrespect, excuse repeated betrayal, ignore their own needs, and call suffering loyalty. For them, the lesson may be learning that commitment without dignity becomes self-abandonment. One soul may need to learn patience, another needs boundaries, one needs to soften, another needs to become stronger, one needs to forgive, another needs to stop returning. This is why no spiritual teacher, label, or theory can give one universal answer for every relationship. The lesson reveals itself through the pattern. Ask what keeps repeating. If you always become the rescuer, perhaps the lesson is to stop believing love means saving people who refuse responsibility for themselves. If you always choose emotionally unavailable people, perhaps the lesson is to stop trying to earn the love that was never freely offered. If you always disappear when someone becomes close, perhaps the lesson is to stop treating intimacy as danger. If you always become jealous, perhaps the lesson is to develop inner security rather than demanding that another person remove every possible threat. If you always silence your needs to avoid conflict, perhaps the lesson is to understand that peace created through self-betrayal is not real peace. These patterns can repeat through different relationships until eventually you become tired enough to look honestly. And sometimes one particular person brings the pattern to its highest intensity. That may be why they feel unforgettable. They became the relationship through which the lesson could no longer remain hidden. Perhaps you had ignored your fear of abandonment for years, but with them it became impossible. Perhaps you had tolerated poor boundaries in every relationship, but with them the consequences became severe enough that you finally changed. Perhaps you had always believed you could fix people through love, but this connection finally taught you that another person's healing cannot be forced. That lesson may hurt, but once learned, it changes every relationship that follows. This is where a connection can become meaningful, even if it does not last. You may look back years later and realize that the person was not the partner you were meant to keep, but the relationship was the experience through which you finally learned what healthy love must include: consistency, mutual effort, truth, respect, freedom, responsibility, and the ability to remain yourself while loving another person. Perhaps before that relationship, you would have accepted almost anything as long as the emotional intensity felt strong enough. Afterward, intensity alone no longer impresses you. You begin valuing peace. You notice character. You stop confusing chemistry with compatibility. You stop interpreting anxiety as proof of love. You stop chasing people who repeatedly demonstrate that they do not want to be present. This is transformation, and perhaps transformation is more important than whether the connection survived. Imagine how different your life becomes when one karmic feeling relationship teaches you a lesson so completely that the old pattern can no longer attract you in the same way. Someone inconsistent appears, and instead of becoming fascinated, you recognize the pattern immediately. Someone tries to control you, and instead of mistaking possessiveness for devotion, you step back. Someone refuses accountability, and instead of spending years waiting for change, you accept what their behavior has shown you. Suddenly, the people who once would have captured your attention no longer have the same power. Why? Because the lesson has changed you. The pattern loses attraction when consciousness no longer needs to learn through it in the same way. This may be one of the clearest signs that a karmic cycle is becoming complete. You stop needing the same pain to understand the same truth. There is something deeply powerful about that. Perhaps life does not need to keep sending the same lesson forever. Perhaps the repetition continues only while the response remains unconscious. Once you see clearly, and choose differently, the future begins changing. This does not mean you will never face similar challenges again, but the challenge no longer controls you in the same way. A trigger appears, and instead of reacting automatically, you recognize it. This is the old fear. This is the old need to chase. This is the old urge to control. This is the old belief that I must prove my worth. Recognition creates space, and inside that space lives choice. Perhaps this is the true spiritual meaning of freedom. Not a life without difficult emotions, a life in which emotions no longer automatically decide what you do. This can become especially beautiful when both people grow at the same time. Imagine a couple whose old pattern has always been criticism and defensiveness. One criticizes because they feel unheard. The other defends because criticism feels like rejection. Every disagreement becomes a battle. Then both begin becoming conscious. One learns to speak from vulnerability instead of accusation. I feel hurt because this matters to me. The other learns to listen without immediately defending. I hear you. Tell me what you need. The same relationship that once produced constant conflict begins transforming. The connection has not changed because some magical force erased karma. It changed because two people changed how they participated in it. Perhaps this is what it means to complete a lesson together. Not avoiding every challenge, meeting the challenge with greater awareness. This may be one of the most beautiful possibilities within the idea of souls meeting again. Not simply that love returns, but that love is given another opportunity to become wiser. Maybe a previous bond, if such a bond existed, was filled with jealousy. Now both learn trust. Maybe there was separation because pride prevented communication. Now both learn humility. Maybe one depended entirely on the other. Now they learn interdependence, where closeness exists without the loss of individuality. Maybe anger destroyed the connection. Now they learn how to disagree without destroying respect. In that sense, the relationship becomes a second chance, not necessarily to recreate the old love, but to evolve it. However, not every connection reaches that outcome, because transformation requires willingness from both people. Sometimes you see the pattern clearly, but the other person refuses. You try to communicate. They manipulate. You set boundaries. They punish you. You ask for honesty. They continue lying. You take responsibility. They continue blaming. At some point, remaining may no longer be growth. It may become repetition. This is where discernment becomes sacred. You must learn the difference between a difficult relationship that is growing and a destructive relationship that is merely cycling. Growth may still contain conflict, but there is accountability. Both people can apologize. Both can listen. Both make adjustments. The pattern slowly becomes healthier. A destructive cycle, however, repeats without genuine responsibility. Promises are made, but behavior does not change. Harm happens, apologies follow, then the same harm returns. Do not confuse repetition with destiny. Sometimes the lesson is that the cycle will continue as long as you keep stepping back into it. This can be painful to accept, especially if the person feels ancient, familiar, irreplaceable, or deeply loved. But perhaps the most important choice in your entire karmic story is the moment when you finally stop saying, "Because I love you, I must stay," and begin saying, "Because I have learned something about love, I can no longer participate in what destroys both of us." That is not hatred. That can be wisdom. You may still care. You may still remember. You may still feel that the connection was extraordinary, but you stop using depth as an excuse for dysfunction. Perhaps the old version of you would have stayed. This time, you choose differently. And that different choice may be the completion. There is also another form of unfinished karma that is much quieter. Unfinished words. Perhaps the relationship feels ancient because there is a strange need to say something you cannot explain. You feel compelled to apologize, even when the present story seems too small for the depth of the emotion, or you feel a powerful need to tell the person that you appreciate them before it is too late. Within a spiritual framework, one might imagine unfinished communication carrying emotional weight across time, but even without that belief, the lesson is valuable. Do not postpone truth unnecessarily. If you love someone, say it in a healthy way. If you hurt them, take responsibility. If you are grateful, express it. If a boundary is needed, communicate it. If the relationship must end, do not create unnecessary cruelty merely because you are afraid of grief. Many karmic feeling relationships become painful because people keep leaving important things unsaid. Pride speaks, fear speaks, silence speaks, but truth does not. Then both people carry stories that could have been transformed by one honest conversation. This is why communication may itself become part of karmic completion. Perhaps the lesson is not only whom you love, it is how you love. Do you disappear when afraid? Do you punish with silence? Do you manipulate through guilt? Do you hide important truths until resentment explodes? Or can you bring awareness into the relationship before the wound becomes deeper? Every conscious choice matters. Vedic-inspired thought also invites us to consider desire, because powerful relationships can expose how easily desire becomes attachment. You may begin with simple appreciation, but soon the mind creates an entire future. You imagine marriage, permanence, shared years, certainty, and security, sometimes before the relationship has even had time to reveal what it truly is. Then reality fails to match the imagined future, and suffering begins. This does not mean desire itself is wrong. The problem arises when your peace becomes dependent upon one particular outcome. You do not simply love the person, you need the story to happen exactly as imagined. They must stay, they must choose you, they must become who you believe they can become. They must fulfill the future you created inside your mind. Now the relationship is carrying not only love, but expectation. And expectation can become a heavy burden. Perhaps one karmic lesson is learning to meet another person as they are, rather than as the character you need them to become. This requires honesty. Can you love the actual person, or are you in love with their potential? Can you accept what their behavior repeatedly demonstrates, or do you keep waiting for an imagined version of them? Do you see them clearly? Or do you use the language of destiny to protect yourself from disappointment? These questions can be uncomfortable, but they are liberating because clear seeing is one of the great enemies of unconscious karma. Patterns survive through denial. Awareness weakens them. This is why some relationships become far less dramatic once you stop lying to yourself about what they are. You may still love someone, but you no longer call inconsistency mystery. You no longer call possessiveness passion. You no longer call emotional unavailability a deep soul test. You see, and once you see, your choices become cleaner. Perhaps this is what an unfinished karmic lesson has been trying to give you all along. Clarity, not certainty about another lifetime. Clarity about this one. There may come a moment when you finally understand the relationship that once confused you endlessly. You stop asking why the person came into your life and realize that their role was connected to a lesson you could only learn through experience. Maybe they taught you how much you are capable of loving. Maybe they taught you that love without boundaries becomes suffering. Maybe they taught you that attraction can be powerful while compatibility is weak. Maybe they taught you that no amount of love can make another person choose growth. Maybe they taught you that your heart can break without destroying your future. Maybe they taught you that forgiveness does not always mean reunion. Maybe they taught you that self-respect is not the opposite of love. These are enormous lessons, and once learned, they remain long after the person leaves. This is why a relationship can end and still be spiritually significant. Its purpose may not have been permanence. Its purpose may have been awakening. You can honor that without romanticizing the pain. You can say, I would not choose to relive everything that happened, but I understand myself differently because I lived through it. That is maturity. There is no need to call suffering beautiful, but there can be beauty in what you became afterward. Perhaps this is why some connections stay in memory without needing to be restarted. Years later, you think of the person and feel no urge to return. The obsession is gone. The anger is gone. Even the longing has softened. What remains is understanding. You see the younger version of yourself who desperately wanted the relationship to work, and you feel compassion for that person. You understand why you stayed, why you chased, why you feared, why you ignored what was obvious. And instead of shame, there is wisdom. That may be one of the final signs that the cycle has changed. You no longer need to blame yourself forever for not understanding sooner. You understand now. That is enough to choose differently. Perhaps the connection was never meant to tell you only, you have loved this person before. Maybe it was saying, you have lived this pattern before. That is a much more powerful message, because recognizing the person is fascinating. Recognizing the pattern is liberating. You may never know whether the soul standing before you truly crossed your path in another incarnation. But if the same lesson keeps appearing between you, that is something you can work with immediately. Watch the pattern. Name it. Do not romanticize it. Ask what it asks from you. If the lesson is trust, practice trust where trust is deserved and discernment where it is not. If the lesson is self-respect, stop negotiating away your dignity. If the lesson is forgiveness, release resentment without reopening doors that wisdom says should remain closed. If the lesson is communication, speak before silence turns into poison. If the lesson is detachment, learn to love without demanding ownership. If the lesson is commitment, stop running from healthy intimacy merely because vulnerability feels frightening. If the lesson is freedom, allow both people room to remain fully themselves. And if the lesson is release, understand that endings do not erase meaning. Perhaps this is what love becomes when it matures. It stops asking only, how can I keep you? It begins asking, how can I become more conscious because I have known you? There is something deeply Vedic-inspired in that shift, because the relationship stops being merely an object of desire and becomes part of the path toward greater awareness. Another human being cannot give you liberation, but relationships can reveal the attachments that keep freedom hidden. That is why love can become such a powerful spiritual teacher. It reaches places philosophy alone cannot reach. You can read about non-attachment for years and still believe you understand it. Then someone you deeply love begins leaving, and suddenly the teaching becomes real. You can read about self-respect and still compromise yourself repeatedly until one relationship finally shows you the cost. You can read about forgiveness until you are genuinely betrayed. You can read about patience until you love someone who requires patience. You can read about truth until telling the truth risks losing something you desperately want. Then the teaching enters the body. It stops being an idea, it becomes a choice. This is perhaps why certain relationships feel so spiritually charged. They take principles that were abstract and make them immediate. The person becomes part of the examination. Not because they were sent to punish you, because intimacy reveals where knowledge has not yet become wisdom. You may know that you should not chase someone who repeatedly withdraws, but can you actually stop when your heart is involved? You may know that jealousy is unhealthy, but can you remain grounded when insecurity appears? You may know that boundaries matter, but can you say no to someone whose love you are afraid to lose? That is where transformation happens. And the beautiful part is that once a lesson becomes embodied, it changes you permanently. You do not merely understand the idea, you become someone who lives differently. Then perhaps the karmic bond has fulfilled something important. Maybe the other person stays and the relationship becomes healthier because both of you learned. Maybe they leave and you carry the wisdom into every relationship that follows. Either way, the lesson is not wasted, and perhaps that is the deeper meaning of love returning with unfinished karma. It does not necessarily return because the universe wants two people to recreate the same romance forever. It may return because consciousness has another opportunity to make a different choice where it once remained unconscious. This time, speak. This time, listen. This time, respect the boundary. This time, forgive. This time, leave without hatred. This time, stay without fear. This time, love without possession. This time, do not abandon yourself. Perhaps that is why the relationship feels familiar. The person may be new to your memory, but the lesson is not. Something inside you recognizes the doorway. We have stood here before in one form or another, and now the same question is being asked again. What will you choose this time? That may be the most powerful question of this entire chapter, because the answer does not depend upon proving who you were before, discovering what happened centuries ago, or recovering a forgotten story. The answer is happening in the next choice you make. When fear rises, what will you do? When jealousy rises, what will you do? When the person disappoints you, what will you do? When love asks for honesty, what will you do? When your dignity and attachment pull in opposite directions, what will you do? When the relationship reaches the same old doorway again, will you walk through it the same way? Or will you finally become someone new? Perhaps this is how karmic stories end, not through some dramatic cosmic event, but through one conscious response that refuses to repeat the old movement. The person may never understand how important that moment is. No one else may notice. But inside you, an entire pattern begins collapsing, and once it collapses, you are freer. So if there is someone you love deeply, even though the relationship is new, yet the connection seems to carry an old lesson that keeps returning, do not become obsessed only with asking whether you loved them before this life. Ask what remains unfinished now. Ask what the relationship keeps revealing, and ask what part of you is being invited to become wiser. Perhaps the love is ancient, perhaps it is not, but the lesson is here, the opportunity is here, and the choice is here. Maybe this person did not return so that the old story could begin again exactly as it was. Maybe they returned so that this time one of you would finally have the courage, awareness, and love to change the ending. Chapter 6. Why this person appears at the exact moment your life is changing. There are moments in life when you are not looking for anyone, not asking for a dramatic connection, and not expecting your inner world to change, yet someone appears at exactly the moment when your old life has begun to feel too small for the person you are becoming. They may arrive during grief, after disappointment, in the middle of loneliness, just before a major decision, or during a period when everything familiar is quietly collapsing, and because of that timing, the connection can feel as though it was waiting for you long before you were ready to understand it. This is one of the most powerful reasons certain people feel older than the relationship itself, because sometimes the mystery is not only in who they are, but in when they arrive. You may look back later and realize that if you had met them 1 year earlier, you would not have understood them. And if you had met them 1 year later, the entire direction of your life might already have been different. The meeting happened inside a narrow window of time when you were vulnerable enough to be reached, awake enough to notice, and unfinished enough to still be changed. Vedic-inspired wisdom often views life not as a collection of random emotional events, but as a field in which actions, tendencies, choices, and lessons unfold through time. And from that perspective, timing can become spiritually meaningful without needing to be treated as supernatural proof. A person may appear when a particular samskara is ready to surface, when an old pattern has become impossible to ignore, or when your dharma, your way of living with greater truth and responsibility, is demanding that you grow beyond the identity you have been carrying. Sometimes the person arrives during a season when you are already breaking apart. Perhaps a long relationship has ended, a dream has failed, a family situation has changed, or you have reached the painful realization that the life you worked so hard to build no longer feels alive. You are not yet sure who you are becoming, but you know you cannot return completely to who you were. And then someone enters your life whose presence seems to touch the exact part of you that was already preparing to wake up. This can make the connection feel almost destined, because the person seems to say the right thing at the right moment, ask the question you had been avoiding, or see a version of you that even you had not fully accepted. Perhaps they encourage you toward a path you were afraid to choose. Perhaps they challenge a belief that had been controlling you for years, or perhaps they simply treat you with enough kindness that you suddenly realize how little kindness you had been accepting from yourself. The timing becomes unforgettable because the person is not entering a stable version of your life. They are entering a doorway. And people who meet us at doorways often become emotionally powerful. They may never understand the full role they played. To them, perhaps it was a conversation, a friendship, a short relationship, or an ordinary meeting. But to you, their presence became connected with a major inner shift. Something they said stayed with you. Something about how they lived exposed how differently you wanted to live. Something about their courage made your excuses feel smaller. Something about their peace revealed how exhausted you had become from fighting battles that were no longer necessary. This is why certain people can feel like catalysts rather than companions. A companion walks beside you through a long part of the journey, while a catalyst may enter briefly and create a reaction that continues long after they are gone. The significance of the connection is not always measured by how long the person stays. Sometimes it is measured by how much movement begins because they appeared. Perhaps before meeting them, you had been emotionally asleep. You were performing routines, meeting obligations, and telling yourself that everything was fine, yet underneath the surface there was a quiet dissatisfaction you could not name. Then this person arrives, and suddenly you begin asking questions you had avoided for years. Are you living the life you actually want? Are you staying where you have already stopped growing? Are you choosing from courage or from fear? Are you protecting your peace or simply avoiding change? The person does not necessarily give you the answers. They make the old answers impossible to believe. That can be one of the deepest forms of awakening. Sometimes we think transformation will arrive through a spiritual vision, a great teacher, or a dramatic event, but often it enters through another human being who unknowingly exposes the gap between the life we are living and the life we know we could be living. You meet someone who is honest and suddenly notice how often you hide. You meet someone who values themselves and begin seeing where you constantly abandon your own dignity. You meet someone who lives courageously and realize how many choices you have been postponing because fear has been making them for you. In this way, the connection becomes powerful, not because the other person is perfect, but because their presence reveals contrast, and contrast creates clarity. Perhaps you have been surrounded by people who normalize your smallest self, and then one person appears who speaks to you as though they can see something larger. They do not rescue you, and they may not even realize what they are doing, but their way of relating to you calls forward a version of yourself that had been waiting beneath habit, fear, and self-doubt. This can create a strange sense that the person has known you longer than they actually have, because they seem to recognize something in you that others missed. They may say, "You are capable of more than this," and instead of feeling like empty encouragement, the words hit a place inside you that was already close to breaking open. You may wonder how they knew, but perhaps the deeper truth is that you knew too and simply needed someone else to say it aloud. This is where timing becomes essential. The same sentence said 5 years earlier might have meant nothing. The same person met during a different season might not have affected you at all. But now you are ready. Readiness changes everything. There are truths we hear many times before we are capable of receiving them, and then one day the same truth enters under different conditions and suddenly changes us. The words did not become more powerful, we became more available. Perhaps certain people arrive at exactly that moment. Not because some cosmic force guarantees a particular romantic outcome, but because life has brought you to the point where the connection can reveal what you are finally ready to see. This is one reason a person can feel so significant so quickly. They are not only entering your life, they are entering a transformation that was already underway. You associate them with awakening because the awakening became visible when they arrived. This is beautiful, but it also creates a danger. You may begin believing that because the person was present during your transformation, they are the source of your transformation. You may think, I became alive because of them, so I cannot continue without them. This belief can turn gratitude into dependence, and dependence can distort the meaning of the connection. The person may have been a catalyst, but the change was yours. They may have opened a door, but you were the one who walked through it. They may have reminded you of your strength, but the strength did not belong to them. This is one of the most important truths in any spiritually meaningful relationship, because otherwise we can give another human being too much ownership over our own becoming. We say, "You saved me," when perhaps what really happened is that their presence helped us finally stop abandoning ourselves. There is a difference, and understanding that difference allows love to remain beautiful without becoming dependency. Perhaps this person appears when you are grieving, and for the first time in months you feel understood. Their presence becomes associated with relief, hope, and the first small return of joy, so naturally they become important very quickly. But the deeper healing is not simply that they made you feel better. The deeper healing may be that their presence showed you that your heart was still capable of feeling something other than pain. That realization belongs to you. Maybe you thought grief had destroyed your ability to love. Then someone arrives and proves that tenderness still exists. Maybe you thought betrayal had made trust impossible. Then one person behaves consistently enough to show that not everyone is the person who hurt you. Maybe you believed your life had already been decided. Then a conversation makes you imagine another future. These moments can feel almost sacred because they reopen possibilities you thought were closed. And perhaps that is why the person feels older than the connection itself. They awaken something that was not created in the meeting. It was waiting beneath the surface. There are also times when someone appears during a period of success rather than pain, but their arrival still changes everything because success itself has begun to feel empty. You may have achieved what you once wanted and still feel strangely disconnected from your own life. Everything looks correct from the outside, yet inside you know something is missing. And then you meet someone whose values, questions, or way of living makes you confront the possibility that you have been measuring your life by standards that no longer belong to you. Perhaps they care less about status and more about meaning. Perhaps they live simply but seem peaceful. Perhaps they speak about purpose with a seriousness that unsettles you. Then suddenly your achievements look different, not worthless, but incomplete. The meeting creates discomfort because it exposes how long you have been avoiding the deeper question of what your life is for. This can also happen through conflict. Not every catalyst arrives gently. Sometimes the person who changes your life is the one who refuses to cooperate with your old patterns. You are used to controlling conversations, and they will not be controlled. You are used to disappearing when things become difficult, and they insist on honest communication. You are used to being praised for overgiving, and they tell you that you are exhausting yourself. You are used to keeping everyone happy, and they ask what actually makes you happy. At first, you may dislike them for it. Yet later you realize that their resistance exposed habits you had mistaken for personality. This is why not every important connection feels comfortable in the beginning. Some people enter as disruption. They disturb the arrangement that kept your old identity intact. And because the old self often prefers familiarity to growth, you may initially resent the person who makes change unavoidable. But after enough time, you realize the discomfort was information. You had outgrown something. The relationship simply made that truth impossible to keep ignoring. Within a karmic framework, This can be understood as a moment when an old pattern meets a condition that finally allows transformation. The person is not necessarily there to become your lifelong partner, closest friend, or permanent companion. They may be there because their presence creates exactly enough friction for you to notice what you keep repeating. Perhaps this is why some people disappear almost as suddenly as they arrived. You expected the relationship to continue because the impact was so large. Yet once the transformation begins, circumstances change, distance appears, or life pulls both of you in different directions. This can feel deeply confusing because you assume that something so meaningful should last. But meaningful and permanent are not the same word. Sometimes someone enters your life not to become part of your entire future, but to make sure you actually have one. That truth can be difficult to accept. We like to believe that every powerful connection must end in togetherness, but sometimes the person's role is more like a bridge. A bridge is not the destination. You cross it because it allows you to reach somewhere you could not reach from where you were standing. Then the bridge remains behind. This does not make it unimportant. Without it, you might never have crossed. Think of the people who entered your life during major transitions. Perhaps someone encouraged you to leave a situation that was destroying you. Perhaps a teacher saw potential you had stopped believing in. Perhaps a friend helped you through grief and then slowly drifted away. Perhaps someone you loved deeply awakened a vision of the person you wanted to become, even though the relationship itself did not survive. Years later, the pain of separation may soften, and what remains is gratitude. You begin to understand that staying forever was not the only way the connection could have mattered. Sometimes a person changes your direction and then leaves you to walk the new road yourself. This can be one of the hardest spiritual lessons, because attachment wants the person who opened the door to keep walking with us through every room. But life does not always work that way. Sometimes the gift is the opening, the rest becomes your responsibility. There is also another mystery hidden inside timing. Sometimes someone arrives before a choice you have been avoiding. You may be considering leaving a job, ending an unhealthy relationship, returning to study, moving somewhere new, creating something, or finally speaking a truth that has been buried for years, and then this person enters your life and somehow makes the decision impossible to postpone. They may not tell you what to do. Their existence simply clarifies something. Perhaps you notice that around them you speak differently about your future. You stop describing the life you are supposed to want and begin talking about the one you actually want. Maybe they ask a simple question such as, "If you were not afraid, what would you choose?" And the answer rises so quickly that you realize fear, not uncertainty, has been controlling you. A question like that can change a life. Not because it contains magical wisdom, because it reaches you at the moment you are ready to answer honestly. This may be why certain conversations remain vivid for years. The words themselves may be simple, but they arrive when your inner world is on the edge of transformation. Timing turns ordinary words into turning points. This is also where the concept of dharma becomes relevant. Dharma is often simplified as purpose, but it can also point toward right living, responsibility, integrity, and alignment with what is true in your present circumstances. A meaningful relationship may awaken dharma by showing you where your life has become divided from your values. Perhaps you meet someone whose honesty makes your own dishonesty uncomfortable. Perhaps their discipline exposes your excuses. Perhaps their compassion reveals how cynical you have become. Perhaps their self-respect makes you see how often you agree to things that violate your own boundaries. The person does not give you dharma. They show you where you have been avoiding it. And that recognition can be profoundly uncomfortable. Growth often begins with discomfort, because the old self is being confronted. This is why some intense connections seem to cause chaos, even when the chaos is not actually created by the person. Their presence reveals contradictions that were already there. You thought you were satisfied. Now you realize you are not. You thought you had healed. Now you see what still hurts. You thought you knew yourself. Now you discover parts of yourself you had never allowed into the light. No wonder the connection feels powerful. It is carrying the emotional weight of an entire inner reorganization. But again, this does not mean every feeling is an instruction. This distinction becomes extremely important in spiritually charged relationships. A person may awaken something deep without being someone you should build a life with. You may feel inspired by them without being compatible with them. You may feel recognition without having mutual commitment. You may love someone deeply while still understanding that the healthiest choice is distance. Feelings are information. They are not always commands. This one truth can protect you from turning spiritual intensity into impulsive decisions. Perhaps the connection tells you that your heart is ready to open again. That does not automatically mean this specific person must become your partner. Perhaps they awaken a desire for adventure. That does not mean you must abandon every responsibility. Perhaps they reveal that your current life feels empty. That does not mean every impulsive escape is wise. Spiritual growth requires both openness and discernment. The heart may reveal what needs attention. Wisdom decides how to respond. This is one of the reasons ancient traditions emphasize discipline alongside insight, because realization without responsibility can become chaos. You can have a profound emotional awakening and still make foolish decisions if you treat intensity as permission to ignore consequences. So if someone arrives at a major turning point, honor what the meeting awakens, but remain grounded in reality. Ask what is actually changing. Ask whether the connection makes you more truthful. Ask whether your choices become more responsible or more reckless. Ask whether you are becoming more conscious or simply more intoxicated by emotion. A spiritually meaningful connection should ultimately deepen awareness, not remove it. Sometimes the person appears when you are ready to stop repeating a specific relationship pattern. Perhaps you have always chosen people who are unavailable, and suddenly you meet someone consistent. At first, the healthy connection may feel strangely unfamiliar because your nervous system is more accustomed to uncertainty than peace. This is another fascinating possibility. Not every important person feels familiar because they repeat the past. Some feel important because they represent an exit from it. Imagine spending years believing love must be earned through chasing, proving, fixing, and waiting, then meeting someone who simply communicates clearly and treats you with respect. Instead of immediate relief, you might initially feel bored, suspicious, or even uncomfortable because there is no emotional chaos to chase. Then gradually you realize something extraordinary. Peace feels unfamiliar because pain had become familiar. This person may appear at the exact moment you are ready to learn a new definition of love. That too can feel like destiny, not because the relationship is guaranteed forever, but because you finally reached the point where you can receive something you would previously have rejected. Readiness again becomes the key. You may have met healthy people before and overlooked them because you were still attracted to old wounds. Now you have changed enough to see differently. Perhaps this is one way karma transforms, not by sending the same pain forever, but by changing what you recognize as attractive once the lesson begins to mature. What once felt exciting now feels exhausting. What once felt boring now feels peaceful. What once looked like passion now looks like instability. What once looked like weakness now looks like emotional honesty. The world has not completely changed. Your perception has. And because perception changes choice, your future begins changing too. Sometimes the person arrives not to become the great love of your life, but to show you what you have been settling for. You may return to your existing relationships and suddenly notice the absence of respect, honesty, or mutual effort that you had normalized. This can create tension because the connection has raised your awareness, and once awareness expands, pretending becomes more difficult. Perhaps before you met this person, you believed your needs were unreasonable, then they listen. You believed your dreams were unrealistic, then they take them seriously. You believed you were too difficult to understand. Then they understand you without making you feel ashamed for being complex. Now you cannot completely return to the old story about yourself. The person becomes significant because they interrupted a false belief. Again, this does not mean you must possess them. Perhaps their role was simply to show you another possibility. This is why some spiritually important connections become mirrors of future potential rather than memories of the past. We often ask, did I know them before? When perhaps the more useful question is, what future version of me becomes visible when they are near? That question can change the direction of the whole audiobook. Maybe the person feels ancient because they awaken something old, but perhaps they feel powerful because they reveal something new. The connection could contain both, a familiar emotional resonance and a new invitation. Perhaps this is why the timing is so precise. You needed enough history to recognize the old pattern and enough maturity to choose something different. Too early, and you would have repeated it unconsciously. Too late, and the opportunity might have passed. Now, however, you stand at a threshold. The person becomes part of the threshold. This is where the concept of free will becomes essential, because spiritual meaning does not remove personal choice. Even if you believe two people were somehow destined to meet, what they do after the meeting remains deeply important. Meeting is not the same as becoming. Recognition is not the same as commitment. Opportunity is not the same as fulfillment. Two people may meet at the perfect moment and still make choices that lead them apart. That does not necessarily mean the meeting failed. Perhaps the meeting itself was the event. Maybe one conversation was enough to begin a change that continued for years. This can be difficult for the romantic mind to accept because we want every meaningful beginning to promise a permanent ending. But some of life's greatest turning points are brief. A doctor can change a life in one appointment. A teacher can change a direction with one sentence. A stranger can restore faith in humanity through one act of kindness. A person you love can reveal an entire hidden world within you and still not remain forever. Duration is not the only measure of significance. Transformation is another. This becomes especially clear years later. At the time, you may have been devastated that the connection did not become what you hoped, but eventually you noticed the chain of events that followed. Because you met them, you began questioning your old life. Because you questioned, you made a decision. Because you made that decision, you entered a different environment. Because you entered that environment, new people, opportunities, and parts of yourself became available. Now you look back and realize that one meeting changed hundreds of things that the other person never witnessed. Perhaps they were not meant to walk every step. They were meant to change the direction. This can transform grief into perspective. It does not erase pain. It gives the pain a larger context. You stop asking only, why did they leave? And begin asking, what became possible because they arrived? That question can reveal hidden gifts. Maybe you became more courageous. Maybe you finally left a situation that was harming you. Maybe you returned to a dream you had abandoned. Maybe you learned how deeply you wanted companionship and stopped pretending you preferred isolation. Maybe you recognized your own capacity to love. Maybe you learned that your standards needed to rise. Maybe you began meditating, studying, creating, traveling, healing, or speaking more honestly. The person may be gone, the movement remains. That is why some connections continue to shape us even after the relationship ends. But there is another possibility: the person stays. Sometimes two people meet at a turning point and actually grow together. This can be beautiful because the connection is not merely a catalyst for individual change. It becomes a shared path of transformation. One person inspires courage in the other offers grounding. One helps the other soften, the other teaches stronger boundaries. Both become different because the relationship creates an environment where growth is supported rather than feared. But even then, the relationship must be built consciously. The feeling of perfect timing is not enough. If two people meet when both are ready for change, That readiness must turn into actions: honest communication, patience, responsibility, respect, and the willingness to allow each other to evolve. Otherwise, even a meaningful meeting can become another old pattern. This is an important reminder. Spiritual significance is potential. Character determines what becomes of it. You may feel that a person came at exactly the right moment, but you must still learn how to love them in the present. You must still communicate. You must still apologize. You must still make choices. You must still respect boundaries. You must still allow the relationship to be real, rather than forcing it to fit a mystical story. Perhaps this is the greatest way to honor a connection that feels divinely timed. Do not romanticize it so much that you stop seeing the actual person. Let them be human. Let yourself be human. If the meeting has meaning, it does not need fantasy to survive. Reality can become sacred enough. Sometimes the person who arrives at the right time also exposes how deeply you fear change. You may love what they awaken, but resist what it requires. They make you imagine a bigger life, but the bigger life requires leaving comfort. They remind you that you deserve respect, but accepting that truth requires setting boundaries. They awaken your creativity, but following it requires risk. They make you realize you are unhappy, but acting on that realization requires courage. Now the relationship becomes complicated because part of you associates the person with possibility, while another part associates them with the loss of everything familiar. This may create push and pull behavior. You move closer, then retreat. You speak honestly, then become afraid. You imagine change, then return to old habits. The person may feel confused, but the real conflict is happening inside you. You want transformation without losing certainty. Life rarely gives both. This is why powerful connections can become emotionally intense, even when there is no obvious external problem. The person becomes a symbol of change, and change threatens the identity you have known. Perhaps this is another reason they feel too important. They represent more than themselves. They represent the door, and if you walk through that door, part of your old life may not follow. This is where courage becomes essential. You must separate the person from the lesson. Maybe they are not asking you to become someone new. Life is. They simply appeared when you could no longer avoid the invitation. If they leave, the invitation may remain. This is one of the strongest signs that the connection was a catalyst rather than a dependency. Your growth continues even without their presence. You do not return completely to who you were. Something has already changed. The question has been asked. The old illusion has been broken. You can try to ignore it, but you cannot fully unknow it. Perhaps this is what people mean when they say, "I was never the same after meeting them." Not always because they remained together, because the meeting altered the internal map. There is a before, there is an after, and somewhere between them stands one person whose arrival made change visible. That is powerful. Yet even here, the deepest wisdom is not to worship the person who stood at the turning point. Thank them, if appropriate. Love them, if the love is healthy. Remember them, if they leave, but continue walking. A doorway is meaningful because you pass through it, not because you spend your entire life kneeling in front of it. This metaphor matters because many people become emotionally trapped in the person who awakened them. Years after the relationship ends, they remain convinced that no future love can matter because this person was the catalyst. But perhaps holding on to the catalyst forever would actually betray the lesson. If they awakened your courage, use it. If they awakened your creativity, create. If they awakened your capacity for love, keep loving life. If they showed you what respect feels like, never return to relationships where respect is absent. If they awakened your spiritual hunger, continue the search. Do not turn the person into a museum where your transformation is displayed but no longer lived. Carry the transformation forward. This is how the connection becomes integrated rather than merely remembered. And perhaps this is what a soul-level meeting within the spiritual framework we are exploring is meant to accomplish. It touches an old impression, activates a present lesson, and opens a future possibility. Past, present, future. All three seem to meet in one person. No wonder the connection feels larger than the number of days you have known them. You are not reacting only to the person, you are reacting to what the person seems to connect inside your life. They touch the past through familiarity. They challenge the present through awareness. They reshape the future through possibility. That combination can create extraordinary emotional weight. This is why you may meet someone and immediately feel that your life is moving, even before anything outward has changed. The movement begins internally. Your priorities start shifting. Old conversations feel empty. Certain environments feel too small. You begin seeing yourself differently. The transformation is subtle at first. Then one day you realize the old version of you would no longer recognize your choices, and perhaps the person who entered your life has become inseparable from the memory of that awakening. If they remain, your gratitude may deepen. If they leave, the connection may become bittersweet. Either way, the invitation is the same. Do not waste the awakening. This is where the chapter must return to the central question. Why now? Why did you meet this person during this particular season? Perhaps there is no mystical answer. Perhaps coincidence, circumstance, psychology, and ordinary human timing explain everything. But even then, the meeting has meaning through what you choose to do with it. And within a Vedic-inspired spiritual view, perhaps timing reflects something more subtle. An old pattern has ripened enough to be seen, a lesson has become ready to be lived, or your consciousness has reached a point where a certain kind of encounter can finally change you. You do not need to prove which explanation is correct. You only need to become honest about what the meeting is asking from you. Is it asking you to heal, to forgive, to leave, to stay, to speak, to become disciplined, to trust, to stop chasing, to begin again, to choose a life that feels more aligned with what you know to be true? That is where the significance lives, because the person may have entered your story at the perfect time, but the next chapter is still yours to write. No matter how powerful the connection feels, they cannot make the choice for you. They cannot heal every wound. They cannot carry your dharma. They cannot live your life on your behalf. Perhaps their role is simply to bring you to the moment where avoiding the choice becomes harder than making it. That is a profound role, but it is not ownership of your future. This distinction is what allows you to honor the connection without becoming trapped inside it. You can say, "You changed something in me," without saying, "Therefore I cannot live without you." You can say, "Meeting you mattered," without insisting, "Therefore you must stay forever." You can say, "Something about this feels ancient," while still respecting the freedom of both people in the present. That is mature love, and perhaps mature love is one of the lessons the meeting was meant to awaken. A love that is deep but not blind, spiritual but not detached from reality, grateful but not possessive, open but not self-abandoning. This is the kind of love that can survive truth. Perhaps that is what makes the timing so meaningful. Maybe you could not have loved this way before. Maybe earlier versions of you would have confused love with fear, possession, or rescue. But now someone appears, and the old ways begin feeling impossible. The meeting becomes both recognition and examination. Can you love more consciously this time? Can you allow another person to matter without making them responsible for your entire emotional life? Can you receive what the connection awakens without demanding that the person remain exactly as you imagine? Can you let love become a doorway to growth rather than another place where fear controls you? These questions may be the real reason the timing feels extraordinary. Perhaps you were not waiting only for the person, you were waiting to become ready for the lesson. And maybe they were not sent to complete you. Maybe they arrived when you were finally ready to stop living as though you were incomplete. That difference changes everything. So if someone has entered your life at a moment when everything else seems to be changing, do not focus only on whether you knew them before. Look carefully at the timing. Notice who you were before they appeared and who you are becoming now. Notice what you can no longer ignore, what you are finally courageous enough to question, and what parts of yourself have begun waking after years of silence. Perhaps the mystery is not simply that you found each other. Perhaps the mystery is that the meeting happened only after your old life had brought you to exactly the point where you could finally understand why someone like them would matter. And if one day the connection changes, if they leave, if life takes you in different directions, or if the relationship becomes something other than what you first imagined, remember this: the person does not have to remain forever for the awakening to remain true. Sometimes someone enters your life not to become part of your entire future, but to make sure you actually have one, and perhaps that is why they came when they did. Not because you were ready to be rescued, because you were finally ready to change. Chapter 7. The deepest love may not ask you to keep them. It may ask you to remember yourself. By the time a connection reaches this depth, the question is no longer simply why you met this person, why they feel familiar, or why the emotions between you seem larger than the amount of time you have shared. The deeper question becomes what exactly their presence has awakened inside you, because sometimes the strongest sign of a soul-level connection is not the feeling that you have known someone before, but the way meeting them seems to uncover a part of yourself that had been buried beneath years of fear, routine, disappointment, or forgetting. This is where the mystery becomes more important than romance, because perhaps the greatest purpose of certain relationships is not to give you another person to hold on to, but to return you to something within yourself that you had lost. You may have spent years believing you were no longer capable of deep love, no longer brave enough to change, no longer worthy of tenderness, no longer spiritually curious, or no longer interested in becoming anything beyond the life you already knew, and then one person appears and the entire inner landscape begins moving. Perhaps they do not even realize what they have awakened. They may simply speak to you honestly, see something in you that you had stopped seeing, challenge an excuse you had repeated for years, or treat your hidden dreams as though they deserve to be taken seriously. Yet because you were ready, their presence becomes a kind of mirror in which an older, deeper, more courageous version of yourself begins to appear. This is why the 7th chapter is the deepest, because all the previous signs can be mistaken for attraction, projection, emotional intensity, attachment, or coincidence. But transformation is harder to ignore. When a person enters your life and something inside you begins becoming more conscious, more truthful, more compassionate, more courageous, or more aligned with what you know you should become, then regardless of whether there is a previous life story behind the connection, the meeting has already become spiritually significant. Within a Vedic-inspired framework, the self is not understood merely as the personality of one moment, and the deepest spiritual journey is not about clinging to every form that appears, but about moving toward greater awareness. From this point of view, a relationship becomes meaningful when it helps reveal what keeps you bound, what keeps you asleep, what keeps you repeating old patterns, and what remains possible when those patterns begin to loosen. Perhaps that is why certain people do not merely make you feel loved. They make you notice where you have not been loving yourself. You may meet someone who respects your boundaries, and for the first time you realize how often you have allowed your boundaries to be ignored. You may meet someone who listens carefully, and suddenly you understand how long you have accepted being unheard. You may meet someone who believes in your potential, and their belief hurts almost as much as it inspires, because it forces you to see how little faith you have been placing in yourself. That pain can be part of awakening. Sometimes recognition is comfortable. Sometimes it is deeply confronting. A meaningful connection may show you beauty, but it can also expose contradiction. You say you value yourself, yet you stay where you are repeatedly disrespected. You say you want peace, yet you continue choosing chaos because chaos feels familiar. You say you want love, yet when healthy intimacy appears, you run because vulnerability feels more frightening than loneliness. Then this person arrives, and somehow all of those contradictions become visible. This is why they may feel as though they know you more deeply than they actually do. Perhaps they are not reading your soul in some supernatural sense. Perhaps their presence simply creates conditions in which you can no longer avoid your own truth. That alone can make the bond feel extraordinary. There are people we meet who allow us to remain exactly as we are. They fit neatly into our habits, expectations and defenses, and nothing inside us needs to change in order for the relationship to continue. Then there are people whose presence creates pressure against the old identity. Around them, your excuses become harder to defend. Your fear becomes easier to see. Your hidden desire for a different life becomes louder. Your old version begins losing its authority, and this can create both love and resistance, because the person becomes connected not only to comfort, but to transformation. You may feel drawn toward them because they awaken possibility, yet afraid of them because possibility requires change. This is one reason some deep relationships contain so much emotional tension. You are not only deciding whether you want another person close, you are deciding whether you are willing to become the person the connection is calling forward. That is a much larger decision. Perhaps the old version of you survived by never needing anyone, so this connection asks whether you can become vulnerable without becoming dependent. Perhaps you survived by pleasing everyone, so the relationship asks whether you can tell the truth even if someone is disappointed. Perhaps you survived by staying small, quiet and predictable, so the person's presence awakens ambitions that demand courage. The connection becomes a doorway between identities. One version of you wants to remain safe. Another is ready to become more alive. This is why love can feel almost frightening when it arrives at a moment of growth. It may seem as though you are falling in love with another person, but at the same time, you are discovering a future self that did not seem possible before meeting them. This creates a powerful association. You begin believing the person and the transformation are the same thing. You think, when I am near them, I feel more alive, so they must be the source of my aliveness. But this is where wisdom must intervene. The person may have awakened the fire. They did not create the fire. The courage was already within you. The tenderness was already within you. The capacity to love was already within you. The desire to grow was already within you. Perhaps it needed a meeting, a crisis, a conversation, or a connection to become visible. But once visible, it becomes your responsibility. This is one of the most liberating truths in the entire audiobook, because if you believe another person owns your transformation, then losing them feels like losing yourself. You become terrified that if they leave, the stronger version of you will disappear too, and this fear can create attachment that slowly turns something beautiful into dependence. But what if the deeper purpose is the opposite? What if they came not so that you would become dependent upon their presence, but so that you would finally discover what remains within you, even when they are not there? This changes the meaning of the relationship completely. Instead of asking, how do I make sure they never leave? You ask, how do I live what they awakened in me, whether they stay or not? That is the beginning of spiritual maturity. Perhaps they awakened courage. Then courage must eventually exist even when they are not encouraging you. Perhaps they awakened self-respect. Then self-respect must remain when loving them requires a difficult boundary. Perhaps they awakened tenderness. Then tenderness must become part of how you move through the world, not only how you treat one special person. Perhaps they awakened spiritual curiosity. Then the search must continue, even if the relationship does not. Otherwise, the gift remains tied to the giver, and you never fully receive it. This is why some of the deepest relationships eventually ask for a kind of inner separation, even if the people remain together. You must stop seeing the other person as your missing half and begin relating to them as one whole human being meeting another. That can make the love stronger. Two incomplete identities demanding rescue from each other will eventually become exhausted. But two people who can stand within themselves can choose closeness from freedom, rather than fear. Perhaps this is what the old idea of soul recognition can become when viewed through greater maturity. Recognition is not, "You complete me." Recognition may be, "Something about meeting you reminds me of what is already complete within me." This is a very different kind of love. It is less dramatic in one sense, but far deeper. It does not need to constantly prove its importance. It does not demand ownership. It does not confuse possession with devotion. It does not say, "Because I love you, you must become the person I need you to be." It says, "Because I love you, I want to see you clearly, including the parts that do not belong to my fantasy." This ability to see clearly is crucial, because spiritual language can sometimes tempt us to idealize people. If we call someone a past life lover, karmic soulmate, or destined connection, we may begin ignoring their humanity. We turn them into a symbol rather than allowing them to be a real person with flaws, boundaries, changing desires, and freedom. But a deep connection should make reality more visible, not less. You should be able to love someone and still acknowledge their limitations. You should be able to feel spiritually connected while respecting a no. You should be able to believe the meeting mattered without insisting that it must become a lifelong romantic relationship. You should be able to honor what was awakened without rewriting reality to keep the fantasy alive. This is especially important because not every person who awakens you is meant to stay. Some people are meant to remain for decades. Others may be present only for a season. This does not make the shorter connection less meaningful. Sometimes a brief meeting does what years of comfort could not do. A person appears, disrupts the old pattern, reveals a truth, and disappears before you fully understand what happened. At first, this can feel almost cruel, because if the impact was so large, why was the time so short? But perhaps duration and purpose are different measurements. A thunderstorm can last less than an hour and still change the atmosphere. A single sentence can take seconds and redirect an entire life. A relationship can be brief and still alter who you become. This is one of the hardest truths for the heart, because the heart often assumes that importance should guarantee permanence. If someone changed you deeply, surely they should remain. If the bond feels ancient, surely it should continue. But life does not always confirm this expectation. Sometimes the person is not the destination, they are the threshold. You cross because of them. Then the path continues. This is where gratitude becomes more powerful than possession. Instead of saying, "If this was real, they should have stayed," you may eventually be able to say, "Because it was real, something important remained even after they left." That may be courage, wisdom, a new standard for love, a new relationship with yourself, a deeper understanding of your own wounds, a spiritual practice, a decision you finally had the strength to make, a life you would never have built if the meeting had not disrupted the one you were living. The person may be gone, but the transformation continues. Perhaps this is one of the clearest signs that the connection was not meaningless. What is false often disappears completely once the excitement ends. What is transformative remains as structure within you. Years later, you may not remember every conversation. You may forget the exact dates, places, and words. Yet you know your life moved differently after them. You became more careful about what kind of love you accept. You stopped chasing unavailable people. You finally started speaking honestly. You stopped apologizing for needing respect. You began choosing environments that allowed you to grow. This is how the person becomes part of your story, even when they are no longer part of your daily life. And perhaps, within a spiritual framework, this is a deeper kind of continuation than physical proximity. Their role has moved inward. But we must also speak about the opposite possibility, because sometimes the person does stay, and this creates a different challenge. If they remain in your life for years, you must allow the relationship to become ordinary enough to survive. This may sound strange, but many people destroy extraordinary connections because they believe the connection must always feel extraordinary. At first, there is intensity, recognition, excitement, mystery, and emotional depth. Then life becomes real. There are responsibilities, fatigue, misunderstandings, routine, bills, health, family, days when neither person feels spiritually profound. This does not mean the connection has lost its meaning. It means love is being asked to become embodied. Anyone can feel destiny during the beginning. The deeper test is whether respect remains when life becomes ordinary. Can you communicate when the magic is quiet? Can you show patience when both of you are tired? Can you take responsibility when you are wrong? Can you remain kind after familiarity replaces mystery? This is where soul recognition, if one believes in such a thing, must become human responsibility. An ancient feeling cannot do the daily work of love for you. It cannot apologize. It cannot communicate. It cannot maintain boundaries. It cannot build trust. Two people must still do those things. Perhaps this itself is one reason souls, within rebirth traditions, would meet again, not simply to experience another burst of recognition, but to learn how to turn recognition into conscious relationship. Maybe in one story there was passion without patience. This time, learn patience. Maybe there was devotion without freedom. This time, allow freedom. Maybe there was love without communication. This time, speak. Maybe there was attachment without self-respect. This time, remain whole. If so, the spiritual meaning of the connection would not be found only in the beginning. It would be revealed through how both people live the relationship. This is why the seventh sign is not simply, you feel transformed. It is that the transformation begins to demand embodiment. You cannot keep saying this person awakened you if you continue living exactly as before. If they awakened truth, your life must become more truthful. If they awakened self-respect, your choices must begin reflecting it. If they awakened compassion, you must carry that compassion beyond the relationship. If they awakened courage, there will eventually be a moment when you must act courageously without their reassurance. Otherwise, awakening remains only emotion. Real awakening changes behavior. This is one of the most important distinctions in any spiritual path. A person can make you feel profound things, but feeling profound things is not the same as becoming profound. A relationship can inspire insight, but insight that never changes action becomes another form of entertainment. Perhaps this is why some people repeat the same intense connection pattern again and again. They keep searching for the feeling of recognition without integrating the lesson. Every new person feels like destiny. Every relationship becomes overwhelming, and every ending leaves the same wound. The names change, the feeling remains, the lesson remains, until one day they stop asking, "Who is my soulmate?" and begin asking, "Why do I keep becoming the same person inside every relationship?" That question is far more transformative. Maybe the great love your soul remembers is not only another person. Maybe it is a way of being that you have forgotten, a way of loving without fear, a way of standing in truth, a way of giving without disappearing, a way of receiving without suspicion, a way of being close without possession, a way of releasing without hatred. Perhaps the person awakens this possibility because some part of you is finally ready to practice it. This is where the title of this audiobook becomes deeper. The love your soul remembers may not mean that the soul remembers one specific lover. Perhaps it remembers the quality of love itself, the openness, the devotion, the courage, the willingness to see another being without immediately turning them into something you own. Maybe the person is important because they bring you close enough to that quality that you recognize it. And suddenly the phrase, "this love feels too old," takes on a different meaning. Perhaps the oldness is not proof of a past romance. Perhaps it is the feeling of touching something fundamental, something human, something spiritual, something beneath the identities you usually carry. Love at its deepest can make the ordinary personality briefly quieter. The need to impress becomes less important. The need to win becomes less important. The need to protect every weakness becomes less important. For a moment, you care more about truth than image. This is why love has so often been used as a spiritual metaphor across traditions, because it can reveal how much of the self is built around fear. When you genuinely care, you are forced to confront selfishness, attachment, jealousy, control, vulnerability, impermanence, sacrifice, boundaries, and freedom. Few experiences show us so much about ourselves so quickly. That is why a person can seem like both gift and challenge. They bring joy, but they also reveal where joy is fragile. They bring closeness, but they expose fear of loss. They bring acceptance, but they reveal where you still reject yourself. They bring possibility, but they also make excuses harder to maintain. This is why the connection can feel spiritually intense. You are not only learning another person, you are watching your own consciousness respond to love. And perhaps that is the real classroom. One of the deepest things this classroom teaches is that love and attachment are not identical. Attachment wants certainty. Love can live with mystery. Attachment wants possession. Love respects freedom. Attachment says, "Stay so I can be okay." Love says, "I value you deeply, but I cannot turn you into the condition of my existence." This does not mean love becomes indifferent. On the contrary, it may become more sincere because fear is no longer doing all the talking. Imagine how differently you would love if you were not constantly trying to prevent loss. You could actually listen instead of planning how to keep the person interested. You could tell the truth instead of becoming whatever you think they want. You could allow space without immediately translating it as rejection. You could appreciate their individuality without interpreting independence as danger. You could stop creating tests, stop withholding affection to gain control, stop measuring every interaction for proof. This kind of love is quieter than obsession, but stronger. It can breathe. Perhaps this is the love your soul actually remembers, not the desperation of clinging, the peace of recognition without ownership. This is also why letting go can sometimes become part of love. There may come a time when you recognize that the relationship is no longer healthy, mutual, or aligned with the people you have become. The bond may still feel deep. The memories may still matter. You may still believe the meeting carried spiritual significance. But meaning does not always require continuation. This is one of the hardest truths in spiritual relationship work, because people often believe that if they let go, they are denying the connection. They think, if this person was important, I must fight forever. But perhaps fighting forever is not always devotion. Sometimes it is fear of accepting that a chapter has ended. If you are meant to learn non-attachment, then perhaps the final lesson is not reunion, it is release without resentment. Can you allow something meaningful to end without calling it meaningless? Can you love someone and still understand that closeness is no longer healthy? Can you carry gratitude without carrying obsession? Can you let them become part of your past without making your future wait for them? These questions require extraordinary maturity, and perhaps some of the deepest karmic relationships exist precisely because the heart must learn this. Not every unfinished bond is completed by getting back together. Some are completed when one person finally stops repeating the attachment. You may have spent years believing that closure would come when they returned, apologized, explained everything, or chose you. Then one day something changes. You realize closure is not a gift they are holding. It is a decision you can begin making. You stop checking, stop replaying, stop building imagined futures, stop asking why you are not enough. You understand that their choices describe their path, not your worth. And slowly, the emotional bond changes. The memory remains, but it no longer owns the present. That is freedom. Perhaps this is karmic completion in one of its most practical forms. The past still exists, but it no longer controls the next choice. This is where the connection can become a blessing, even if the ending was painful, because eventually you stop asking what you lost and begin noticing what became possible after you stopped trying to hold what was already leaving. You rebuild. You rediscover friendships. You return to work, creativity, study, prayer, meditation, or purpose. You start becoming someone whose entire emotional world is no longer organized around one person. And perhaps years later, if you think of them, the memory feels different. There is no desperate wish to recreate the past. There is simply a quiet understanding. You mattered. You changed me, and I continued. This is a deeply mature kind of love. It does not need to erase history. It places history in its proper place. This can also apply when the relationship remains. You may stay together, but both people must continuously release old versions of each other. If you love someone for years, they will change. You will change. The person you first met will not remain exactly the same. Attachment says, become the version I originally loved. Mature love says, let me keep learning who you are becoming. This may be one of the most beautiful spiritual practices inside a long relationship. You stop assuming you already know the person. You remain curious. You allow growth. You release outdated expectations. Perhaps this is another way souls meet again, even within the same lifetime. The person beside you today is not exactly the one you met years ago, and neither are you. You keep meeting new versions of each other. The question becomes whether love can evolve with the changes. This is why the deepest connection may not be the one that remains identical. It may be the one that repeatedly chooses truth as both people change. There is humility in this. You stop saying, I know exactly who you are. You say, I want to keep seeing who you are becoming. Perhaps that is closer to real recognition than any mystical certainty. Recognition without assumption, love without possession, closeness without the erasure of individuality. This is where the relationship becomes spacious enough for both people to grow. And if the connection is ancient, perhaps that growth is the reason it returned. Maybe you did not meet again to freeze an old story. Maybe you met to create something more conscious than what existed before. This is why remembering the past, even if it were possible, might not be the greatest gift. Imagine remembering every previous role, every mistake, every betrayal, every loss, every promise. Would that automatically make you wiser? Not necessarily. You could remember and still repeat everything. Memory alone is not transformation. Perhaps forgetting has a function too. If the past remains hidden, you are forced to meet the person as they are now. You cannot demand love because of an old promise. You cannot punish them for something they do not remember. You cannot rely on history to replace present trust. You must begin again. This can be understood as a profound spiritual fairness. Whatever may or may not have happened before, both people meet in the present with fresh freedom. The only connection that matters practically is the one they choose to build now. Perhaps this is why ancient memory, if it exists, often appears symbolically rather than clearly. A feeling, a dream, a strange familiarity, an emotion without a story. Enough to awaken curiosity, not enough to remove free will. This preserves the responsibility of the present. You still have to choose, and perhaps choice is more sacred than recognition. You can recognize someone and treat them poorly. You can feel destiny and still behave selfishly. You can experience profound emotion and still refuse to grow. But when you choose patience, honesty, responsibility, and freedom, something real changes. This is why the strongest evidence of a meaningful bond is not how dramatic the beginning feels. It is what kind of person the relationship helps you become. Do you become more compassionate? Not weaker. Compassionate. Do you become more honest? Not cruel, honest. Do you become more courageous? Not reckless, courageous. Do you become more capable of boundaries without hatred? More capable of forgiveness without self-betrayal? More capable of devotion without possession? Then perhaps the connection is doing important work. But if the relationship repeatedly makes you smaller, frightened, dependent, dishonest, or disconnected from your own values, then a feeling of ancient recognition should not be used to justify it. No spiritual story should require you to ignore reality. This may be the deepest warning of the entire audiobook. You can believe in soul connections and still use discernment. You can explore karmic ideas and still respect psychology. You can wonder whether you knew someone before and still judge the relationship by present behavior. These do not contradict one another. Wisdom can hold mystery and reality at the same time. Maybe that is what the 7th chapter is asking you to do. Keep the mystery, but do not lose yourself inside it. Wonder about the past, but live in the present. Honor the connection, but honor your dignity too. Love deeply, but do not turn love into a reason to abandon truth. This balance is difficult precisely because powerful relationships make extremes tempting. You may want certainty when only mystery is available. You may want permanence when life offers only a season. You may want the other person to confirm the meaning of the connection when the real meaning may be unfolding privately within you. Sometimes the other person will never understand the role they played. They may move on. They may remember the relationship differently. They may not believe in past lives at all. And yet you can still honor what happened within you. Meaning does not require agreement from everyone involved. But meaning also does not give you permission to impose your interpretation on them. This is love with freedom. You can privately believe that your souls crossed before, while still respecting that they may understand the connection differently. You can cherish without claiming, remember without chasing, love without insisting. This may be one of the highest forms of emotional maturity. There is another deep possibility that deserves attention. Sometimes the person who feels ancient does not awaken romantic love at all. It may be a friend, teacher, child, parent, mentor, stranger, or even someone who challenges you. Perhaps they awaken compassion, perhaps responsibility, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps courage, perhaps a forgotten part of your dharma. This matters because when people hear the phrase soul connection, they often reduce it to romance. But a human life contains many forms of love. The person who changes your life most deeply may never become your partner. A child may awaken patience. A parent may awaken forgiveness. A friend may awaken courage. A teacher may awaken purpose. A rival may expose pride. A stranger may remind you of kindness. If consciousness truly learns through relationship, then every meaningful role becomes spiritually important. Perhaps the same soul does not need to return in the same role. Perhaps the lesson matters more than the label. This possibility helps us release the obsession with identifying exactly who someone was before. Instead of asking whether they were a lover, sibling, parent, or friend in another lifetime, ask what quality the present bond is developing. Love, patience, truth, boundaries, compassion, detachment, self-respect, service? That question produces growth immediately. The old role might remain unknowable. The present lesson is visible. This is why transformation becomes the strongest sign. It is usable. It changes the life you are actually living. Perhaps there is one person in your mind as you hear these words. Someone whose arrival divided your life into a before and after. Maybe you still speak to them every day. Maybe they disappeared years ago. Maybe the relationship never became what you hoped. Maybe you have spent countless hours wondering whether you knew them somewhere before. Try asking a different question now. What woke up in me because I met you? Perhaps you discovered your capacity to love. Perhaps you finally confronted your fear of being abandoned. Perhaps you stopped accepting half-hearted relationships. Perhaps you learned that you could survive loss. Perhaps you began taking yourself seriously. Perhaps you remembered a dream. Perhaps you became interested in spirituality because the connection raised questions ordinary life never raised. Whatever the answer is, pay attention to it. That may be the real treasure. If the person remains, allow the awakening to deepen. If they leave, carry it forward. Do not give the gift back just because the giver is gone. This is where many people lose years. They believe the best version of themselves existed only inside one relationship. They say, I was happier with them, I was more alive with them, I was more creative with them, and then they spend the future trying to recreate the person instead of reclaiming the qualities. But perhaps those qualities were never theirs to take away. Maybe you were happier because you allowed yourself to open, more alive because you began risking, more creative because you felt inspired. The capacity remains. This realization can become incredibly powerful after heartbreak. Instead of asking how to return to who you were with them, ask how to carry forward what was best in you during that chapter. Then the relationship stops becoming a grave. It becomes a seed. And seeds are not meant to remain buried forever. They are meant to become something. Perhaps this is why the deepest love may eventually ask you to stop looking backward. There comes a point when honoring the past means building the future. You can remember them without waiting for them. You can value what happened without living only in what happened. You can believe the bond was meaningful without requiring another meeting. This is not betrayal. It may be completion. Sometimes the final karmic act is continuing. Not returning, not repeating, continuing. That can require more courage than reunion, because reunion keeps the old story alive. Continuing requires trusting that meaning can survive without repetition. Maybe you meet again someday. Maybe you do not. Either way, your life must continue becoming. This is what brings the 7th chapter back to its deepest truth. Perhaps the real purpose of certain relationships is not to prove that two souls share a history, but to make both people more conscious of the life they are living now. Past life curiosity can be beautiful, but the present is where Dharma is lived. The present is where apologies are made. The present is where boundaries are set. The present is where courage is practiced. The present is where love becomes behavior. So even if your soul remembers someone, your responsibility remains here, today. How will you treat them? How will you treat yourself? Will you repeat old fear? Will you use the connection as an excuse to become dependent? Will you ignore reality because the story feels mystical, or will you allow the mystery to deepen your awareness? That choice determines whether the connection becomes another cycle or a doorway to growth. And perhaps this is what makes the love feel ancient. Not that your mind can recover a forgotten name, but that something deep within you recognizes the lesson before you can explain it. The lesson of loving without losing yourself. The lesson of receiving without clinging. The lesson of letting another person matter without making them responsible for your entire existence. The lesson of remaining open to mystery while staying grounded in truth. These are old human lessons, perhaps very old. Maybe that is the deepest thing your soul remembers. There may come a moment when you finally stop asking, "Were we together before?" because a more powerful question has replaced it. What did meeting you make possible in me? When that question becomes clear, the entire relationship changes in memory. You stop seeing the person only as someone you wanted to keep. You begin seeing them as someone whose arrival awakened a threshold. Maybe you crossed it together. Maybe you crossed alone, but you crossed. And once you are on the other side, you cannot completely return to who you were. That is transformation. Perhaps the person who feels ancient did not come to remind you only of another lifetime. Perhaps they came to remind you that you have another life available within this one. A life with greater courage, greater truth, greater self-respect, greater compassion, greater freedom. A life in which love is no longer something you beg to receive, chase to keep, or fear losing every moment. A life in which love becomes a way of seeing clearly. That may be the greatest gift. And perhaps this is why some connections continue to feel sacred long after the emotional intensity has changed. You eventually stop needing the person, but you remain grateful for what became visible when they appeared. There is no desperation left, only recognition. Not necessarily recognition of them, recognition of yourself. You look back and realize, that relationship showed me who I was becoming, and perhaps that is why it felt so familiar from the beginning. Maybe the deepest familiarity was never only between two people. Maybe something in you recognized the version of yourself that the meeting was about to awaken. Perhaps the heart was not whispering only, "I know you." Perhaps it was also whispering, "Through you, I am going to remember me." That changes everything, because now you understand that the person does not have to become your possession in order for the love to become part of your life. They can remain, they can leave, they can change, they can become a memory. But what you awakened can continue. This is where love stops being merely a relationship and becomes a path toward awareness, a path toward freedom from old patterns, a path toward learning what is yours to hold and what must be released, a path toward becoming capable of loving another person without abandoning yourself. And perhaps that is the highest form of reunion, not simply finding the same soul again, finding the part of yourself that every meaningful love was trying to lead you back toward. So if there is someone you barely knew before loving them deeply, someone whose presence felt older than the time you shared, someone who made you question whether the heart can remember what the mind cannot, do not spend your entire life demanding proof of another lifetime. Look at the life in front of you. Look at who you were before them. Look at what woke up. Look at what healed. Look at what still needs healing. Look at what you can no longer pretend not to know. And then ask the question that matters more than all the others. What did my soul become ready to remember because you entered my life? Perhaps the answer will be love. Perhaps dignity. Perhaps courage. Perhaps freedom. Perhaps the ability to release. Whatever it is, keep it, live it, become it. Because perhaps the deepest purpose of this connection was never simply for you to remember them. Perhaps it was for you to finally remember yourself. And now, as the love your soul remembers comes to an end, perhaps one person is still resting quietly in your thoughts, someone you barely knew before they began to matter, someone whose presence felt familiar before enough memories existed to explain that familiarity. Someone whose eyes, voice, timing, and emotional impact made you wonder whether this connection truly began in this life. Maybe you will never know for certain. Maybe there is a forgotten story between your souls. Or maybe the depth came from wounds, timing, recognition, and the parts of yourself that were ready to awaken. But perhaps the greatest mistake would be spending your entire life trying to prove where the love began, while ignoring what the love is teaching you now. If this person awakened courage, keep the courage. If they awakened tenderness, do not bury it again. If they exposed your fear of abandonment, heal that fear. If they taught you boundaries, protect them. If they showed you how deeply you can love, remember that the capacity to love belongs to you, even if the person does not remain forever. Some people enter our lives as companions, some as mirrors, some as teachers, and some as doorways. A doorway does not always walk beside you after you cross it, but without that doorway, you may never have reached the life waiting on the other side. This is why a connection can end without becoming meaningless, and why someone can leave while what they awakened continues to shape you for years. Perhaps this is the deeper lesson hidden inside ancient feeling love. You were never meant to turn another soul into your possession. You were meant to become more conscious through the experience of loving them. You were meant to learn the difference between devotion and dependence, between closeness and control, between remembering someone and refusing to release them. And if the relationship is still part of your life, do not let the mystery of the past make you careless with the present. Love them here. Listen here. Speak honestly here. Respect their freedom here. Whatever may have happened before, the relationship you are responsible for is the one being created through your choices today. But if they are gone, perhaps you do not need to spend another year standing at the same closed door. You can honor what happened without making your future wait for someone who is no longer walking beside you. You can carry gratitude without carrying obsession, memory without chains, and love without demanding another ending. Maybe one day you will stop asking, "Who were you to me before?" and begin asking a far more powerful question, "Who did I become because I met you?" Perhaps that is where the answer has been hiding all along. Because maybe the deepest proof of a meaningful connection is not a dream, a strange coincidence, a feeling of déjà vu, or even the sense that you have loved someone before. Maybe the deepest sign is that after meeting them, you can no longer return completely to the person you used to be. Something woke up, something remembered, something became ready. And whether this person was part of your story for a lifetime, a season, or only a few unforgettable moments, perhaps their greatest purpose was never simply to make you remember them. Perhaps they came so that, through loving them, you would finally remember something far more important: your own heart, your own truth, your own path, and the person you were always capable of becoming. So if one love in your life has always felt strangely older than the years you shared, perhaps you do not need to chase the past for an explanation. Simply carry the lesson forward, because maybe your mind met them recently. But somewhere much deeper, love had been waiting a very long time to wake you.